Hello, story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It started during a weekend trip I took about a year ago. The kind of trip that doesn't feel like it'll be memorable until something happens to etch it into your mind forever. My best friend, Eric, and I had planned a quick getaway to a small mountain town. We both needed a break from our jobs, the endless grind of emails, meetings, and deadlines. The town was about a 6-hour drive from the city and nestled in a valley surrounded by thick pine forests. A perfect spot to unplug and recharge, or so we thought. Eric and I weren't the kind of guys who did luxury resorts or fancy accommodations. We preferred places that had a bit of history, places that felt like they had a story to tell. When we stumbled upon an online listing for the Pinewood Inn, a rustic, decades-old hotel with antique charm, we booked it immediately. The website boasted of roaring fireplaces, creaky wood floors, and a cozy, old-world vibe. The photos made it look warm, inviting, and a bit rough around the edges, exactly what we wanted. We arrived late on a Friday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and purple, and a cold wind whistled through the pines. The Pinewood Inn stood at the end of a narrow gravel road, its silhouette framed by the fading light. The building looked even older in person, with its weathered wooden siding and flickering porch light. As we checked in, the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes but a distracted demeanor, handed us the keys to room 204. "The second floor has the best views," she said, her smile faltering just slightly. It wasn't something I thought about at the time, but later I'd recall the way her voice had a faint edge of hesitation. The room itself was small but comfortable. A queen-sized bed with a patchwork quilt sat in the center, flanked by mismatched bedside tables. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and a single window looked out over the dense forest behind the inn. A faded armchair sat in one corner, its fabric worn but still plush. The air carried a faint scent of pine mixed with something older, something faintly musty. Eric flopped onto the bed, groaning about how much he needed the break. I laughed, tossing my duffel bag onto the chair. "This place has character," I said, running my hand along the wooden dresser that looked like it had been there since the inn's opening. That first evening felt blissfully normal. We headed down to the small dining area, where we shared a simple meal of pot roast and mashed potatoes. The inn's dining room had an odd mix of charm and eeriness, with its dim lighting and framed black and white photographs of what I assumed were long-deceased guests. A grandfather clock ticked loudly in the corner, its chimes marking the passing hours. By the time we returned to room 204, I felt that comfortable kind of tired you get after a long day. Eric was already half asleep, scrolling through his phone with one arm flung over his head. I pulled back the quilt and slipped into bed, appreciating how quiet the inn was. No traffic noise, no city hum, just the soft rustle of the trees outside. I stared at the ceiling for a while, my mind wandering aimlessly. The wooden beams above me cast faint shadows in the glow of the bedside lamp. It was the kind of night where nothing remarkable seemed likely to happen, the kind of night where you could sink into the silence and feel the weight of your own thoughts. But silence, I've come to learn, isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it hides something waiting to be heard. The first night was unremarkable, or so it seemed at first. I drifted off easily, lulled by the quiet of the forest and the rhythmic creaks of the old inn settling in the night. Eric, as usual, was snoring within minutes, his breathing heavy but oddly comforting. I woke up briefly sometime after midnight, noticing the pale light of the moon streaming through the window. Everything felt still, almost unnaturally so. Shrugging it off, I turned over and fell back asleep. It wasn't until the next morning that something felt off. I woke to Eric shaking my shoulder, his face tense. "Dude, did you hear that last night?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Hear what?" I mumbled, still groggy. He sat down on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. There was this noise, like footsteps, slow, heavy ones. I thought it was just someone in the hall at first, but it sounded like it was coming from inside the room. I blinked at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. The room was small, and besides the bed, the armchair, and the dresser, there wasn't much space for anything or anyone else. "You sure it wasn't from the hallway?" I asked, sitting up. He shook his head. "It stopped right by the bed. I swear it felt like someone was standing there, just watching." I laughed nervously, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. "You probably dreamed it," I said, though even as I spoke, I felt a pang of doubt. Eric wasn't the type to get spooked easily, and the way he looked pale, his jaw tight, made it hard to dismiss his words entirely. We brushed it off and went about our day. Breakfast at the inn's dining room was simple but hearty, and we spent the morning wandering the nearby hiking trails. The fresh air and sunlight helped ease the tension from the strange start to the day. By lunchtime, Eric seemed more like himself, cracking jokes and pointing out the occasional squirrel or bird that crossed our path. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Eric wasn't one to exaggerate, and his reaction earlier kept replaying in my mind. I found myself glancing back at the inn as we walked away, the darkened windows of our room staring back at me like hollow eyes. That evening, we decided to stay in, too tired from hiking to go back out. The inn's dining room was quieter than the night before, with only a few other guests scattered at the tables. As we ate, I found myself drawn to the old photographs on the walls again. There was one in particular that caught my eye, a black and white image of a young woman standing in front of what looked like the very same room we were staying in. She wore a plain dress, her hair pulled back neatly, but her expression was hard to read. Her eyes seemed too focused, too intense. "Do you think they just decorate with creepy photos to set the mood?" I asked Eric, nodding toward the picture. He glanced over, his fork paused mid-air. "Yeah, probably," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. After dinner, we headed back upstairs. The hallway felt different that night, colder, quieter. The overhead light flickered faintly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with each step we took. Our room felt the same as before, small, slightly musty, but otherwise normal. Still, I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach as we settled in for the night. I read for a while, flipping through a worn paperback I'd brought with me, while Eric scrolled through his phone. We didn't talk much, but the silence between us wasn't the usual comfortable kind. It was heavy, almost oppressive. At some point, Eric fell asleep. His snores filled the room again, a steady rhythm that was oddly reassuring. I turned off the lamp and lay back, staring at the ceiling beams in the dark. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, barely audible over Eric's snoring, a soft creaking sound, like someone shifting their weight on an old wooden floor. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings made noise. It was probably just the wind, or maybe the pipes. But then it came again. Creak. It was slow, deliberate, and unmistakably coming from within the room. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was closer now, near the dresser. I squinted in the darkness, but I couldn't make out anything unusual. My hand groped for the bedside lamp, fumbling to turn it on. The light flooded the room, and for a moment, everything looked normal. The dresser, the armchair, the quilt on the bed, it was all just as it had been. I exhaled slowly, feeling a little ridiculous for letting my imagination run wild. And then I saw it. The chair, the armchair in the corner. When we first checked in, it had been angled slightly toward the window, as if inviting someone to sit and enjoy the view. But now, it was turned directly toward the bed. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't touched the chair. Neither had Eric. I nudged him awake, my voice barely above a whisper. "Eric, wake up," he groaned, swatting at me like I was an annoying alarm clock. "What?" "The chair," I said, pointing. He blinked at it, then at me. "What about it?" "It wasn't like that before," I said, my voice trembling. Eric stared at it for a moment, then shook his head. "Maybe the cleaning staff moved it," he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "No one's been in here," I shot back. We ended up pushing the chair back to its original position before crawling back into bed. Neither of us said much after that, but I could tell Eric was just as uneasy as I was. We left the lamp on that night, but the light didn't help. Not really. Because even with the room illuminated, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something had changed, something subtle but undeniable. And whatever it was, it felt like it was just getting started. The morning after the chair incident, Eric and I sat in the dining room, bleary-eyed and sipping coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on a burner for hours. The innkeeper, an older woman with a voice as soft as the creak of a door hinge, wandered between the tables, refilling cups and making small talk. Neither Eric nor I brought up the chair at first, as though speaking about it in daylight might make it worse. But as the dining room began to empty, I finally broke the silence. "Did you feel anything weird last night? I mean, besides the chair?" Eric's eyes flicked up from his coffee. "You mean like footsteps?" I nodded. He sighed, rubbing his face. "Yeah, I heard it again, man. Right before you woke me up. It wasn't in the hallway. It was inside the room, same as before." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Finally, Eric glanced around the room, making sure no one was listening, and leaned closer. "I think we should ask the innkeeper," he said. I wasn't sure how to approach the topic. "Hey, has anyone reported ghostly footsteps or possessed furniture in room 8? Didn't seem like the best way to start the conversation. But as the innkeeper approached with the coffee pot, Eric spoke up before I could stop him. "Ma'am," he said, his tone polite but firm, "is there any history we should know about in room 8? The innkeeper's face froze for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to catch my attention. She recovered quickly, smiling and pouring more coffee into his cup. "All these old places have stories," she said lightly. "Nothing to be worried about." But her evasive tone only made me more suspicious. "What kind of stories?" I pressed. She hesitated, her gaze darting toward the kitchen door. Then, lowering her voice, she said, "Well, there was a woman who stayed in that room many years ago. She passed away under unusual circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" Eric asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and unease. The innkeeper opened her mouth to answer, but seemed to think better of it. "I shouldn't say," she muttered. "It's all in the past now." And with that, she hurried away, leaving us with more questions than answers. That day, we tried to distract ourselves with more hiking and a visit to a nearby antique shop, but the unease lingered. Every time we passed the inn, its weathered exterior seemed less charming and more ominous. When we returned to our room that evening, I immediately noticed that the chair had moved again this time. It was positioned right in front of the window, as though someone had been sitting there watching the world outside. "I didn't touch it," Eric said, his voice defensive. Neither did I. We stared at the chair for a long moment before Eric finally grabbed it and shoved it into the corner. "There. Let's see if it moves now." The tension in the room was suffocating. We tried to distract ourselves with a card game, but every little sound, the wind rattling the windows, the distant creak of floorboards set my nerves on edge. By the time we turned in for the night, I was so tightly wound that even Eric's snores couldn't lull me to sleep. And then the knocking started. It was faint at first, just a soft tap 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 coming from the wall behind the bed. I froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, louder this time. "Eric," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned and rolled over. "What?" Listen. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate. It wasn't the random creaks and groans of an old building. It was rhythmic, purposeful. Eric sat up, his face pale in the dim light. What the hell is that? I don't know, I whispered. We stared at the wall for a moment. Then Eric grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. He shone the beam across the wall, but there was nothing there, just peeling wallpaper and a few cobwebs in the corners. The knocking stopped. We sat in silence, the only sound our racked breathing. But just as I started to relax, a loud thump came from the ceiling, as though something heavy had fallen. What was that? I asked, my voice shaking. Eric didn't answer. He was already out of bed, pulling on his shoes. We're checking this out, he said. Reluctantly, I followed him. Armed with our phones and a small flashlight I packed, we ventured into the hallway. The inn was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Where do you think it came from? I whispered. Eric pointed toward the end of the hall, where a narrow staircase led up to the attic. No way, I said, shaking my head. Come on, he said. We have to know. The attic door was old and warped, its paint peeling in long strips. Eric turned the knob slowly, and the door creaked open with a sound that made my skin crawl. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old furniture covered in sheets and boxes piled haphazardly in the corners. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something faintly metallic, like blood. We stepped inside, our flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. At first, everything seemed normal, or as normal as a dusty old attic can be. But then I saw it, a set of footprints in the dust, leading from the far corner to the attic door. Do you see that? I whispered. Eric nodded, his face pale. Let's follow them. We crept forward, our footsteps barely making a sound. The footprints stopped in front of an old trunk, its lid slightly ajar. Eric knelt down and lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of old photographs, letters, and a small hand mirror with a cracked frame. What is this stuff? I asked, leaning closer. Eric picked up one of the photos and held it under the flashlight beam. It was the same woman I'd seen in the photo downstairs, the one with the intense eyes. That's her, I said. Before Eric could respond, the attic door slammed shut behind us. The sound of the attic door slamming was like a gunshot in the confined space, reverberating through the stale air. Eric and I froze, our breaths caught in our throats. The beam from his flashlight shook as his hands trembled. Who's there? Eric called out, his voice wavering but loud enough to cut through the suffocating silence. No response. The only sound was the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath our feet, as though something or someone was moving ever so slightly in the shadows around us. I gripped his arm, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Eric, we need to get out of here, I whispered. He nodded but didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the open trunk before us, the woman's face staring back at us from the old photograph. Her eyes seemed almost alive, the intensity of her gaze pulling at something deep within me. Then, the footsteps began. They weren't ours. The sound came from behind us, slow and deliberate, each step pressing down with a creak that set every nerve in my body on edge. I whipped around, shining my flashlight toward the source. At first, there was nothing, just the same dusty sheets and forgotten furniture. But as the light moved, it caught something in the far corner, a figure, barely visible, standing unnaturally still. It was a woman. Her silhouette was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakably human. She wore a long, old-fashioned dress, and her hair was pulled back into a severe bun. But her face was wrong. The features were distorted, as though I were looking at her through rippling water. Her eyes were dark voids, hollow and endless. She stepped forward. Eric, I choked out, my voice barely audible. He turned and saw her too. The flashlight in his hand dropped to the floor, the bulb flickering and casting eerie, shifting shadows across the attic. The woman moved again, her steps soundless but deliberate. Her gaze was fixed on us, her dark, empty eyes pulling us in like black holes. Eric grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. "Run!" We bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard we pushed or pulled, it felt as though it had been welded shut. Behind us, the air grew colder, each breath forming a visible cloud in the dim light. The woman was closer now, her distorted features clearer and more horrifying. Her mouth opened, and though no sound came out, I felt it a low, vibrating hum that resonated deep within my chest, filling me with an unbearable sense of dread. Eric banged on the door with his fists. "Help! Someone, help us!" The vibrations grew stronger, shaking the very floor beneath us. Boxes toppled over, their contents spilling across the attic. A chair slid across the room as though propelled by an invisible force, slamming into the wall with a deafening crash. And then, the lights went out. Total darkness enveloped us, and for a moment, there was only silence. But the silence was worse. In the pitch black, I could feel her presence, the oppressive weight of her gaze pressing down on us. "Eric," I whispered, reaching out blindly. "I'm here," he said, his voice shaking. We fumbled for our flashlights, the small devices feeling like our only lifeline. When I finally managed to turn mine on, the beam of light revealed her standing directly in front of us. Her face was inches from mine, her hollow eyes boring into me. Her mouth opened again, wider this time, impossibly wide, as though her jaw had unhinged. And then I heard it a scream, not with my ears, but inside my head. It was deafening, a piercing wail of anger and sorrow that made me drop the flashlight and clutch my ears. Eric was on the ground, writhing in pain, his hands over his ears as well. The scream didn't stop, it grew louder, more intense, until I thought my skull would crack under the pressure. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. My ears rang, and I could barely hear my own labored breathing. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. "Eric," I croaked, my throat dry and raw. He groaned, slowly sitting up. "What the hell was that?" Before I could answer, the trunk slammed shut, the sound echoing through the attic. We scrambled to our feet, adrenaline overriding our pain and exhaustion. The door to the attic creaked open. We didn't wait to question it, we ran. Down the narrow staircase, through the hallway, and into the lobby. We didn't stop until we were outside in the cold night air. We stood there, gasping for breath, the inn looming behind us like a dark, silent sentinel. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant hum of cars on the highway. Finally, Eric broke the silence. "We're leaving. Now." I nodded, my hands still shaking. "Agreed." We didn't bother going back to the room for our belongings. Whatever was in that attic, in that inn, could keep them. The cold night air hit us like a wall as Eric and I stumbled out of the inn, our bodies trembling and our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The oppressive weight that had suffocated us inside was gone, replaced by the unnerving quiet of the world outside. The inn stood behind us, dark and silent, its windows black pits that seemed to watch us as we leaned against the car to catch our breath. Eric fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped them onto the gravel. He cursed under his breath, his usual calm demeanor completely shattered. I bent down to grab them, my own fingers numb and unsteady, and handed them back to him. "We're not staying here another second," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "Agreed," I muttered, glancing back at the inn. It looked different now, as though it had absorbed some of the terror we'd experienced inside. The once quaint and charming facade seemed twisted, the architecture bearing an almost sinister quality. Eric started the car, the headlights cutting through the darkness as he pulled out of the gravel lot. Neither of us spoke as the inn disappeared in the rearview mirror. The road stretched ahead, empty and silent, except for the hum of the tires on the pavement. The adrenaline that had fueled us began to wane, replaced by a gnawing sense of disbelief. I rubbed my temples, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woman's hollow eyes, her distorted face, the unbearable scream, these images refused to leave my mind. What was that? Eric finally broke the silence. His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. What the hell did we just see? I shook my head. I don't know, but it felt real. It was real, he said firmly. That wasn't some trick of the light or a weird dream. That was something else. The road stretched on, and the silence between us grew heavier. Eric drove with a single-minded focus, his eyes locked on the horizon, as though he could outpace whatever had happened back at the inn. We finally stopped at a gas station miles away. The bright fluorescent lights, a harsh contrast to the oppressive darkness we had fled. Eric parked the car, and we sat there for a moment, neither of us wanting to leave the safety of the vehicle. I'm going to call someone, Eric said, pulling out his phone. Who? The cops? I asked, my voice tinged with sarcasm. And say what? Hey, we saw a ghost. They'll think we're insane. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. Maybe not the cops, but someone has to know about that place. It's not normal. I sighed, leaning back against the seat. My body ached from the tension, and my mind was a whirlpool of fear and confusion. I just want to leave it behind. Whatever that was, it's not our problem anymore. But as much as I wanted to forget, the weight of what we'd seen hung over us like a dark cloud. It wasn't just fear, it was guilt. The photograph, the woman in the attic, the strange energy of the inn, it all pointed to a story we didn't fully understand. After refueling and grabbing some much-needed coffee, we found a cheap roadside motel and checked in. The bright, modern decor was a welcome change from the heavy, antiquated style of the inn. But even with the comfort of normalcy, I couldn't sleep. Eric stayed up too, scrolling through his phone with a furrowed brow. I finally broke the silence. What are you looking for? Anything about that place, he said, his tone clipped. I want to know what we walked into. He found it after an hour of searching, an article buried deep in the archives of a local newspaper. The inn had a history, one that explained everything we had experienced. Years ago, it had been the site of a horrific tragedy. A woman named Margaret, the same woman in the photograph, had lived there with her husband. She had been young, vibrant, and deeply in love, but their marriage had been marked by jealousy and violence. One night, after an argument, Margaret's husband had killed her in the attic before taking his own life. The article described strange occurrences reported by previous guests. Footsteps in empty hallways, whispers in the night, and a woman's silhouette seen staring out of the attic window. The inn had changed owners several times, each claiming they couldn't endure the eerie happenings. I knew it, Eric said, his voice a mix of triumph and dread. That place is cursed. The weight of the story settled over me. Margaret wasn't just a ghost, she was a victim. Her pain, her anger, her sorrow, they lingered in that attic, trapped in a loop she couldn't escape. What do we do? I asked quietly. Eric looked at me, his face pale and drawn. There's nothing we can do. We got out. That's all that matters. But even as he said it, I knew he didn't believe it. Neither did I. The next morning, we left the motel and drove home in silence. The events of the night before felt like a distant nightmare, but the memory of Margaret's hollow eyes stayed with us. Weeks passed, but the experience refused to fade. Every creak of the floorboards in my apartment, every shadow in the corner of my eye, brought it all rushing back. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had left something unfinished. Eric seemed to cope better, throwing himself into work and avoiding any talk of the inn. But I could see it in his eyes, the fear, the guilt, the lingering questions. Had we disturbed something that should have been left alone? Or had Margaret reached out to us for help, only for us to abandon her to her torment? I still don't have the answers. But I know one thing for certain. I will never set foot in that inn again. And if you ever come across a place like it, I suggest you do the same. Sometimes the past refuses to rest, and when it doesn't, it's best to leave it behind. As time passed, the memory of that night at the inn began to fade into the background of my life, but it never disappeared completely. Some nights, when the world is quiet and the only sound is the faint hum of the refrigerator, I find myself thinking about Margaret, her hollow eyes, the sorrow etched into her every movement, and the overwhelming despair that filled that attic. Eric and I spoke about it a few times in the weeks that followed. We both tried to rationalize what we'd seen, pinning it on exhaustion, stress, or some shared hallucination. But deep down, we both knew better. There was something beyond explanation in that place, something neither of us could fully understand or forget. I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind, searching for clues we might have missed. Had Margaret tried to tell us something? Was there more to the story than the article had revealed? And most haunting of all, could we have done something to help her? One day, curiosity got the better of me. I reached out to a local historian who had written extensively about the area. He confirmed the tragic story of Margaret and her husband, but added details that made my stomach churn. According to his research, Margaret's death wasn't just a crime of passion. Her husband had been consumed by paranoia, convinced that she was unfaithful, a belief that had no basis in reality. In his delusion, he had isolated her from friends and family, turning their home into a prison. The attic, where she spent her final moments, had been her refuge and, ultimately, her tomb. Hearing these details made everything worse. Margaret's pain wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological. She had lived her final days in fear, trapped in a cycle of love and terror. Knowing this, the weight of our encounter grew heavier. Eric, on the other hand, refused to dwell on it. "What's done is done," he said firmly when I brought it up. "We were lucky to get out of there. Let it go, but I couldn't. Not entirely." I started having nightmares Margaret's face, twisted in anguish, her voice calling out to me in a language I couldn't understand. Each dream felt more vivid than the last, as though she were reaching out from the void, desperate for someone to hear her. I considered going back to the inn, driven by an inexplicable need to find closure. But every time I thought about stepping foot inside that cursed place again, fear gripped me like a vice. What if I couldn't leave a second time? Instead, I began researching ways to honor Margaret's memory. I learned about rituals and practices meant to bring peace to restless spirits. I even contacted a medium, though I never followed through on meeting them. The idea of opening that door again, metaphorically or literally, was too terrifying. Eventually, life moved on. Work, relationships, and the daily grind took over, and the events of that night became a shadow in the background. Eric and I drifted apart, not out of animosity, but because the experience had created a rift neither of us could bridge. He wanted to forget, and I couldn't. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself wondering about the inn. Is it still standing? Have other travelers stumbled upon it, unwittingly walking into the same nightmare we did? Did Margaret finally find peace, or is she still there, trapped in that attic, waiting for someone to hear her story? I don't have the answers, and maybe I never will. But one thing is certain, that night changed me. It taught me that the past isn't always content to stay buried, that the walls of a place can hold memories, pain, and sorrow. If there's one thing I've taken away from this experience, it's a newfound respect for the unknown. We go through life thinking we understand the world, but there's so much we can't explain, so much we can't see or comprehend. So, if you ever find yourself in a place that feels off, trust your instincts. Sometimes, leaving is the best decision you can make. And if you ever hear the faint sound of footsteps in an empty room or see a shadow move where it shouldn't, remember this story. Not all cries for help are meant for us to answer. And with that, I leave you with a final thought. Some stories don't have neat endings or comforting resolutions. They linger, just like Margaret's sorrow, waiting to be told and remembered. Good night, and be careful where your curiosity leads you. I'm not someone you'd call adventurous by any means, but I've always had a deep appreciation for nature's stillness. There's something about the woods, the crisp air, the crackle of a campfire, and the quiet hum of the wild that feels like an escape from the chaos of daily life. Growing up in a small town in Oregon, surrounded by dense forests, I spent a lot of time outdoors, though always in the safety of a group. This story, however, takes place during my first and likely last solo camping trip. It was the end of October, a time when the air turns cold, the leaves blaze with fiery colors, and the woods become eerily quiet. I'd been working non-stop for months, the stress piling on like weights on my shoulders. I craved solitude, a break from emails, meetings, and the buzz of city life. So, when I found a 3-day weekend on my calendar, I made an impulsive decision to spend it alone in the wilderness. The plan was simple. Drive up to Black Pine National Forest, park at a trailhead, hike about 5 miles into the woods, and set up camp near Clearwater Lake. It wasn't a popular spot, which made it perfect for solitude. I packed the basics: tent, sleeping bag, a couple of freeze-dried meals, a first aid kit, and a trusty flashlight. The day I set out was gray, with low-hanging clouds threatening rain. My 1999 Jeep Cherokee groaned under the weight of my gear as I navigated the winding mountain roads. The drive itself was uneventful, the kind that leaves your mind wandering. When I finally reached the parking lot at the trailhead, I noticed mine was the only car there. For a fleeting moment, I hesitated, feeling the weight of the isolation. But I shook it off. After all, this was what I came for. The hike to Clearwater Lake was beautiful in its simplicity. Towering pines lined the narrow dirt path, their branches swaying in the chilly breeze. The earthy scent of damp soil and fallen leaves filled the air, grounding me in the present. Occasionally, a squirrel would dart across the trail, or the distant call of a bird would echo through the trees. It was just me in the forest, exactly as I'd hoped. By the time I reached the lake, the afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the water. Clearwater Lake was smaller than I'd imagined, its surface so still it mirrored the surrounding trees perfectly. I found a clearing near the shore and began setting up camp. The act of pitching the tent and unrolling my sleeping bag felt oddly satisfying, like building a tiny fortress against the wilderness. With camp set up, I sat by the water and ate a quick dinner, instant noodles cooked on a portable stove. The quiet was profound, almost oppressive. Every now and then, I caught myself straining to hear something, anything: distant voices, footsteps, even the sound of a car engine. But there was nothing, just the rustle of leaves and the occasional splash as a fish broke the lake's surface. Night fell quickly, and the temperature plummeted. I lit a small fire and sat close, warming my hands. My phone had no signal, and the idea of being completely cut off from the world began to feel less freeing and more unsettling. I told myself to relax. This was what I wanted: to disconnect, to recharge. But as the flames flickered and the shadows danced across the trees, a sense of unease crept in. I turned in early, zipping myself into my sleeping bag inside the tent. The ground beneath me was cold and unforgiving, but exhaustion quickly took over. The last thing I remember was the sound of the wind brushing against the fabric of the tent. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, disoriented. At first, I thought it was the cold that roused me, but then I realized the fire outside had completely died out, leaving the camp in total darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on. The narrow beam illuminated the inside of the tent, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Everything appeared normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The forest was silent, too silent. No wind, no crickets, not even the occasional rustle of a nocturnal animal. My heart began to race. I lay still, straining my ears for any sound. And that's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on wood. I told myself it was probably a branch swaying in the wind, or maybe a woodpecker. But as the sound grew louder, more deliberate, I felt my stomach tighten. The tapping wasn't random, it had a pattern, a cadence, like a signal. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I was plunged into darkness. My breath hitched as I smacked it against my palm, desperately trying to bring it back to life. When the light finally came back on, I scanned the inside of the tent, my heart pounding like a drum. The tapping stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay there, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, listening to the oppressive silence that had replaced the tapping. When morning finally came, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the tent, I felt a wave of relief. But as I stepped outside, stretching my stiff limbs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Near the fire pit, where I'd sat the night before, lay a single, small pile of rocks, neatly stacked. I hadn't put them there. The morning fog still clung to the forest floor, swirling around the trees like some strange mist from a forgotten world. I tried to shake off the chill that had lingered through the night, but the unease I felt in my gut wasn't something that could be easily dismissed. The pile of rocks near the fire pit sat there, untouched, mocking me. I told myself I was just overthinking things after all. It was possible I had unconsciously stacked them the night before. Maybe I had moved them without realizing it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I hadn't touched those rocks. I made myself a cup of coffee to shake off the odd feeling, watching as the steam rose from the mug, twisting into the cold air. The silence of the forest still felt oppressive. I hadn't heard any birds, no distant rustling of wildlife, just the echo of my own movements. I glanced over at the rocks again, still arranged in a perfect little stack. It was as though someone had taken the time to place each one with care. I took a deep breath and pushed the thought out of my head. I was here to enjoy the wilderness, not to let my mind wander into weird places. The day was brightening, and I needed to explore a little. Maybe a hike would help clear my mind. I packed a light bag with water, snacks, and my map, deciding to venture deeper into the forest. I followed the trail along the edge of the lake, the path winding between towering trees. The lake, which had looked so peaceful the evening before, now seemed more like a vast, empty expanse. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the gray sky above like a mirror, giving the entire scene an eerie, otherworldly quality. The further I walked, the more distant I felt from the world I knew. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees standing like silent sentinels. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, and it felt as though every step I took was being watched. I tried to focus on the natural beauty of my surroundings, but it was hard to ignore the growing sense of dread that tightened my chest. Was I just being paranoid? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone in these woods. About an hour into my hike, I stopped for a break, sitting on a large boulder near a small clearing. I unwrapped my sandwich, the dull sound of rustling paper the only noise. It was then that I heard a faint, rhythmic thumping. At first, I thought it was my heartbeat, thudding too loudly in my chest from the anxiety that had been creeping up on me. But then I realized the sound was coming from further away. It was soft but distinct thump, 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 like footsteps, but not in any direction I could see. I stood up quickly, heart racing again. I strained my ears, trying to locate the source of the noise. The forest was still, and there was no one else in sight. But the sound continued, muffled and distant. It was as if someone, or something, was moving around in the woods, just out of view. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was just the wind moving through the trees, or perhaps a large animal making its way through the underbrush. But it didn't sound like wind. It sounded deliberate, calculated. The thumping stopped abruptly, and in that silence, I felt my stomach drop. It was as though whatever had been making the noise had noticed me and decided to wait. I didn't stay much longer in that spot. I packed up my things, trying to keep my cool, and headed back toward camp. The walk back was slower than the hike out, my mind racing with thoughts of what I'd heard. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was no one there. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was higher in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I dropped my bag by the tent and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. Maybe the forest had its own rhythms, its own way of speaking. I wasn't used to being alone out here, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I looked at the pile of rocks again, the perfect stack, as if placed there by someone with intention. This time, I didn't feel like I could chalk it up to my own absent-mindedness. I decided to take a walk around camp, trying to shake the growing discomfort that was pooling in my chest. The lake still looked beautiful, but the peacefulness had a hollow quality to it now. It wasn't just the absence of sound that bothered me, it was the feeling that the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I wandered to the opposite side of the lake, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. As I made my way along the shore, something caught my eye. There, on the ground near a large cluster of ferns, was a small object, a twig, bent at an odd angle. It looked like it had been placed there, not fallen naturally. I bent down to inspect it, my heart skipping a beat when I saw that it wasn't just a bent twig. The end of it had been snapped clean off, leaving a jagged, sharp edge. But what disturbed me the most was the way it had been placed, like a signal or a marker. My mind raced. Was someone else here? Had someone been watching me the whole time? I quickly stood up and backed away from the spot, my breath coming faster now. My eyes darted around, looking for anything else out of place, but there was nothing. The forest, once so inviting, now felt like a trap. I didn't stay out long after that. I returned to camp, my thoughts swirling. I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, but something about this trip didn't feel right anymore. The rocks, the strange tapping noise, the bent twig, it was all too much to ignore. I tried to convince myself that there was some logical explanation, but the feeling of being watched, of being observed, gnawed at me. As I sat in the tent later that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in my bones. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation, the strange events, or something else entirely, but I knew that I wasn't alone in those woods. I just had no idea who or what was out there, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. Every time I tried to shake off the feeling that something was off, it seemed to intensify. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of something just beyond reach, something I couldn't see but could feel pressing against me from all directions. The once comforting hum of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, was now replaced with silence. Silence that pressed in on me, making the small sounds of my own movements seem unbearably loud. I tried to keep myself busy, distracting myself with the mundane tasks that made up the routine of camping, gathering wood, tending to the fire, keeping my campsite clean. But nothing felt right. The shadows seemed longer, the trees taller. Every time I glanced up, the forest appeared just a little darker, a little more foreboding. And the rocks. The stack of rocks. It was always there, taunting me, as if to remind me that something or someone was watching. Each time I looked at them, they seemed to shift just slightly, as though they had been moved since the last time I saw them. My mind was playing tricks on me, I knew it. But the small part of me that still wanted to rationalize everything couldn't help but wonder, was I really imagining things? Or was something strange happening right in front of me? One evening, as I was gathering more firewood at the edge of the forest, I noticed something strange. There, near the base of a large oak tree, was a trail of small, broken twigs scattered across the ground. At first glance, it seemed natural wind, animals, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I took a step closer, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The twigs weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged in a deliberate pattern, forming a path that led deeper into the woods. I stood still, my heart beating in my throat. Who could have done this? It wasn't like animals could arrange twigs this way. And if it was a person, why would they leave such an odd trail? My instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to turn back and leave the forest behind. But something in me, something curious and unsettled, compelled me to follow the trail. So, cautiously, I stepped onto the path. Each footstep seemed to echo louder in the stillness of the forest. The air was damp and cool, the scent of pine and earth thick around me. With every step, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The path wound through the dense underbrush, leading me deeper into the trees, further away from camp. I hadn't planned on going this far, but something about the trail, something about the strange magnetic pull of the forest kept me going. The deeper I went, the more the forest began to feel different. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting in unnatural ways, blocking out the sky. The further I walked, the darker it seemed to get, even though the sun was still setting in the distance. The shadows felt alive, moving in ways that didn't make sense. It was like the forest itself was aware of me, and every step I took was a step deeper into something unknown. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking, but soon I came upon something that made my heart race. In a small clearing, just off the path, was a collection of rocks similar to the ones at my camp. But these were larger, more carefully arranged. The rocks were stacked in a pattern, forming a rough, circular shape. And in the center of the circle was something even more unsettling, a pile of bones. I froze. The bones weren't animal bones. They were human bones, their sharp, jagged edges bleached white by time. The sight of them made my stomach turn, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I stepped back, my legs trembling beneath me. This wasn't a part of nature. This wasn't something animals did. Someone had been here, and they had been here for a long time. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and leave this place, but something held me in place. I don't know if it was fear, or curiosity, or the sense that I had already gone too far to turn back, but I couldn't move. My eyes lingered on the bones for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The forest seemed to hold its breath as I stood there, motionless. Then I heard it again, that thumping, the rhythmic noise that I had first heard days ago, just outside of camp. It was distant, but unmistakable, and this time it was closer. Thump, thump, thump. I spun around, my heart racing. The sound was coming from behind me, from deeper within the forest. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel that something was out there, something that had been following me since the moment I arrived. My breathing quickened, and my hands began to tremble. I didn't know what to do. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the forest as quickly as I could. But the sound those footsteps were getting louder. Thump, thump, thump. It was as though they were closing in on me. I started backing away from the bones, not taking my eyes off the clearing. Suddenly, the sound stopped. I didn't wait another second. I turned and ran, my feet crashing through the underbrush, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear branches snapping behind me, but I didn't dare look back. The path back to camp felt longer now, and I was sure I could hear something following me. When I finally burst back into the familiar clearing near my camp, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I didn't take a moment to assess the situation. I just threw myself into the tent, locked it, and pulled the flap shut tight. My pulse pounded in my ears as I sat there in the dark, my thoughts racing. What had I seen? What had I heard? The bones, the trail, the footsteps, none of it made sense. But it was real. I knew it was real. I sat there for hours, not daring to leave the safety of my tent. The silence outside felt heavy, oppressive. The sounds of the forest had returned, but they were different now. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the distance, the occasional bird call. But nothing felt normal anymore. Nothing felt safe. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. And as the darkness stretched on, I couldn't help but feel as though the forest itself was waiting for me to make my next move. I couldn't sleep. Not after what I had witnessed. Not after what I had felt in the forest that day. The night had fallen heavy over the camp, but I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at the pit of my stomach. Every slight noise outside the tent sent me into a panic. Every shadow seemed to stretch further than it should. I was trapped in my own mind, replaying the images of bones and strange footprints over and over. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight in my lap, a tiny sliver of comfort in a world that felt increasingly unsafe. The night dragged on like that, each hour stretching into the next. And just when I thought I could force myself to close my eyes, to forget what had happened, it started. A knock, soft at first, like a tap against the side of the tent. At first, I thought it was my imagination, or perhaps the wind brushing against the fabric. But then it came again, a louder tap, and then another. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out all other sounds. The air felt thick with dread, my breath shallow and uneven. Every muscle in my body was taut, coiled like a spring ready to snap. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but the words caught in my throat. I could barely move, let alone speak. The knocking continued, each tap more deliberate than the last. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the voice came. It wasn't a voice at all, really. It was a sound, a low, guttural growl, one that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It was coming from outside, muffled by the thick fabric of the tent, but the tone was unmistakable. The sound of something or someone trying to communicate. The chill that crawled up my spine wasn't just fear, it was terror, pure and raw, gripping me in its icy fingers. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. All I could do was listen, frozen in place, my mind racing to understand what was happening. Then the growl stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and ragged in the quiet of the night. My mind was spinning. Was I going insane? Was I imagining this? Or was there truly something out there, something waiting for me to make the next move? I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight, the beam of light feeling like a lifeline in the overwhelming darkness. My hand was shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it as I clicked it on. The light flickered for a moment, casting long, trembling shadows around the interior of the tent. With the flashlight in my grip, I crept toward the entrance, my heart thumping in my chest. My ears were straining to catch any sound from outside, but all I could hear was the thudding of my own pulse. I opened the flap just a crack, the outside world still bathed in the eerie darkness of the forest. The knocking had stopped, but something was different now. The air was colder, the trees standing still in unnatural silence. My breath came out in visible puffs. The temperature had dropped so suddenly. I took a cautious step out of the tent, keeping low to the ground, my eyes darting around the camp, looking for anything that could explain the noise I had heard. The faint glow from the campfire still flickered weakly, casting a soft light over the rocks I had placed around it earlier. The fire was dying out, but the shadows it cast seemed to move and shift as if alive. Then I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the flickering light of the campfire, a figure stood. It was tall, impossibly tall, and almost blending into the darkness of the trees. My blood ran cold as I stared at it, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure wasn't human. The outline was too tall, too thin, its movements too fluid and unnatural. I could feel my body trembling, a wave of panic crashing over me. My instinct screamed at me to run, to flee as fast as I could, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my mind racing, trying to piece together what I was seeing. The figure didn't move at first. It simply stood there, watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see its face. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was as if the figure was waiting for me to make a move, to acknowledge its presence. The air around me felt thick with tension. The forest was still and quiet, the only sound being the rush of my own heartbeat in my ears. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even move. All I could do was stare at the figure, waiting for it to make the next move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure took a step forward. It wasn't a step like any human would take. It was more like a glide, its legs moving with an eerie fluidity that defied logic. It was coming toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, each step seemingly drawing me deeper into the forest with it. I couldn't take it anymore. My body finally obeyed my frantic mind, and I turned to run, sprinting back toward the tent, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the figure following me, its footsteps not making a sound on the ground, but I could feel it gaining on me. The air around me grew colder with every passing second, and I could hear the faint sound of the growl again, that same guttural noise from before. I reached the tent, my hands trembling as I fumbled to zip it up, but it was too late. The figure was already there, standing just outside the tent. I could feel its presence, the oppressive weight of it, and I knew it was just waiting for me to acknowledge it. My heart was in my throat now, my body trembling with fear. There was no way I could outrun it. No way I could escape whatever it was that had been haunting me in these woods. And then, in the stillness of the night, it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It was deeper, more guttural, like the growl I had heard earlier. But now it had a form, a meaning. It was speaking to me, but the words were incomprehensible. They echoed in my head, vibrating through my skull as though they were being spoken directly into my mind. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to understand, but the words were alien, twisted. All I could feel was fear, overwhelming and suffocating. The fear of the unknown, the fear of what I was facing, the fear of what this thing wanted from me. And then, the figure did something I'll never forget. Slowly, it raised its hand. The long, slender fingers stretched toward me, impossibly long, the skin pale and stretched thin over what should have been bone. And just before it could touch me, everything went black. The last thing I felt was a cold, cold chill, that sensation of ice running through my veins, and then nothing. I woke up with a start. The first thing I noticed was the overwhelming silence. The kind of silence that envelops everything, so thick that it presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. I was lying on the cold ground, my body sore and stiff. I reached out instinctively, feeling the dirt and leaves beneath my fingertips. For a moment, I was disoriented, unsure of where I was, but then it all came rushing back, the figure, the voice, the cold, the terror. I shot up, my heart hammering in my chest. The camp was no longer where it had been. The tent was gone. The fire was nothing but smoldering embers. My equipment, my backpack, the tools, the lanterns were scattered across the forest floor. It was like the woods had swallowed everything whole, leaving only traces behind. But the most unsettling thing of all, the figure was gone. I didn't see it standing in the distance, watching me like it had earlier. There was no sound of its footsteps, no growl echoing through the trees. It was as though it had never been there at all. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing to piece together the events of the night. Had it been a dream? No, it couldn't have been. The fear I had felt was too real, too tangible. The darkness had pressed in on me like a living thing. The memory of those eyes watching me, the strange voice speaking to me, all of it was too vivid to be a mere illusion. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand answers from the universe, but I had no one to ask. No one to explain what had happened to me. I stood there in the forest, shivering despite the warmth of the rising sun, trying to make sense of the wreckage around me. The overwhelming sense of wrongness was still hanging in the air. The woods felt alien, like they had changed in the span of a few hours. It wasn't just the landscape that felt different. It was the very atmosphere, the way the trees loomed higher than before, the way the ground beneath me felt unfamiliar. I glanced around, hoping to find some sign of what had happened, but there was nothing. Just silence. The normal sounds of the forest birds chirping, insects buzzing were absent. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something, or perhaps for me to leave. I felt the weight of the moment press on me. Every part of my body screamed for me to turn around and walk away from this nightmare, to never come back. But there was a nagging feeling deep inside me that I couldn't ignore. What if I didn't leave? What if I came back here? Would it be worse next time? Or would I finally understand what had been happening in these woods? I didn't know, and I didn't have any answers. I started to gather my things, moving quickly, as if the very act of returning to normalcy could make sense of what had happened. My hands shook as I packed up the remnants of my campsite. I wasn't sure how much time had passed since I collapsed. Hours? Days? It didn't matter. All I cared about now was leaving. I tried to start a fire again, but the wood was damp, the embers from the previous fire smoldering weakly. I gave up after several attempts. The frustration gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside. It didn't matter. I was done. I was done with this place, done with the strange figure, done with whatever had happened in the woods. I packed everything as quickly as I could, not bothering to check the surroundings any longer. The sound of my boots crunching against the underbrush was the only noise I heard. It was the only sound I wanted to hear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me as I moved through the woods. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Only the forest, silent and still. I moved faster, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The further I went, the more desperate I became. I had to get out. The air felt thick again, like something was closing in around me, tightening its grip. My instinct screamed for me to run, but I couldn't. I had to move carefully. I couldn't risk making a mistake. I couldn't afford to be trapped again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the edge of the forest. The familiar sight of the trailhead was a relief. The woods, with their secrets and their horrors, were finally behind me. I stepped out into the clearing, the sunlight hitting my face like a balm. But even in the light, I didn't feel safe. I stood there, looking back at the forest. I had escaped, but I didn't feel free. The memory of the figure, of the sound, of the growl, it all still clung to me like a shadow, impossible to shake off. I wasn't sure what I had just gone through. I wasn't sure if it was real, or if I was simply losing my mind. But the fear was real. The terror was real. The forest had changed me, even if I didn't understand why. I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me, a soft rustling in the brush. My body tensed, every muscle locked in place. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I could still feel the presence from the woods, as though it was still there, lingering, waiting. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. My hands were clammy, my legs weak beneath me. But I kept moving. I didn't look back again. As I walked down the trail, I couldn't help but wonder, what was out there in the woods? What had I encountered? What had been watching me all this time? There were no answers, only more questions. When I finally reached my car, I couldn't leave fast enough. I threw my bag into the back seat, slammed the door, and started the engine. The tires kicked up dirt as I sped down the winding road, away from the woods, away from whatever had been there, away from the fear that still gnawed at my insides. But as I drove further and further from the woods, one thought lingered, heavy in my mind. Was I really safe? Or had something followed me out of those woods, something that would never let me go? I didn't sleep that night. Even with the comforting hum of the car's engine and the rhythmic movement of the wheels beneath me, my mind refused to settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the trees again, the figure standing in the shadows, those unblinking eyes locked onto mine. Even now, as I drove through the winding roads, away from the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there. Something had followed me, silently, just beyond my reach. It was as though the very essence of that place had attached itself to me, like a shadow that never left. When I finally reached the nearest town, I found a motel. A small, run-down place with flickering lights and a quiet, indifferent receptionist. The kind of place where you check in, keep to yourself, and leave without making a fuss. I paid for the room without a word, barely glancing at the woman behind the desk. My mind was elsewhere, somewhere deep in the woods that I had just left behind. The room felt safe, yet, at the same time, it didn't. I locked the door behind me, checked the windows, and pushed the furniture against the walls, anything to make sure no one could sneak in, no one could get to me. But even as I did this, I felt the madness creeping in, the paranoia, the sense that I was being watched, even though there was no one there. I turned on the TV, the flickering screen offering some distraction from the thoughts that had taken root in my mind. The low murmur of voices, the meaningless noise, kept the silence at bay. For a few minutes, I managed to calm myself, focusing on the mundane. But then, the images began to shift. The news anchor's face blurred, and all I could see were the trees, those tall, dark figures swaying in the wind, casting shadows that seemed to dance and stretch into the corners of my vision. It was just the after effects of the night, I told myself, but the unease never fully left. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. Every creak of the motel, every gust of wind against the windows, felt like a signal. The woods had followed me, and whatever was out there was still out there, waiting, watching. The next morning, I checked out of the motel, a heavy feeling still in my chest. I didn't want to be anywhere near that town. I didn't want to be anywhere near any place that could remind me of what I had encountered. It wasn't just the terror I had experienced. It was the uncertainty, the knowledge that I had stumbled upon something beyond my understanding, something that I couldn't explain, no matter how hard I tried. As I drove away, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. I couldn't stop checking the rearview mirror, convinced that someone or something was following me. The strange sounds from the woods echoed in my ears, and I thought I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, always just out of sight, always too far to truly grasp. Weeks passed, and the world continued on. Life returned to its normal routine. But something had changed in me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been part of something that went beyond the ordinary, something that was tied to the land itself. The woods had a way of pulling you in, bending time and space until you didn't know what was real anymore. It had altered something deep inside me, and even now, as I write this, I can still feel its grip on me. I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the fear had simply exaggerated everything. Maybe the figure had been a figment of my imagination, a byproduct of the isolation and the strange atmosphere of the forest. Maybe the growl had just been an animal, perhaps a bear or a wolf, though I knew deep down that wasn't it. No, there was something more ancient and powerful. The woods had a life of their own, and it wasn't a friendly one. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the less convinced I became. I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, the way they seemed to pierce through me, like they knew me, knew my every fear in secret. The voice that had spoken in the darkness, it still echoed in my mind, as if it were a warning or maybe a curse. I still couldn't make sense of it. And what had happened after? The way I woke up in the woods, disoriented and alone, with no sign of the figure, no sign of the struggle, no sign of the terror that had gripped me. It didn't fit. It didn't make sense. I reached out to the few people I knew, trying to make sense of it all, but no one seemed to understand. Everyone dismissed it, chalking it up to an overactive imagination or the stress of being out there alone for so long. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel what I felt. The fear, the weight of the unknown, the undeniable presence of something that wasn't quite human. It wasn't just the physical experience. It was the psychological toll it took. The way my mind constantly returned to the forest, to that place where reality seemed to bend and twist. The longer I tried to forget, the more it consumed me. I couldn't escape the feeling that the woods were still out there, somewhere. That whatever had watched me in those trees was still watching. It's been months since that night, but it still haunts me. I've tried to move on, to get back to normal, but the shadows of that place linger. always just behind me, always just out of sight. I can't shake the feeling that the forest didn't just change the woods, it changed me. And whatever I encountered out there, whatever it was that was waiting, is still waiting for me. There's a part of me that wants to go back to confront whatever it was that terrorized me, to find answers, to prove to myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I remember the way the trees felt, the way the silence pressed in around me, the way the air seemed thick and wrong. And I know, deep down, that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some things are too dangerous to confront. It was the sort of night where the city buzzed with life, yet I found myself craving something a little more unusual. I had spent the whole day immersed in the mundane, working a desk job that had me glued to a screen. From morning till evening, everything had felt predictable. The same faces, the same conversations, the same coffee that had gone cold before I'd even taken a sip. But deep down, I had a yearning for something different. Something that would break the monotony. It wasn't anything specific, just the need for an escape. And that's when I stumbled upon the old theme park. It wasn't a new discovery for me. I had known about the place for years. It was a local legend. Most people avoided it, dismissing it as just another crumbling relic from a forgotten era. It was an abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. It had been shut down long before I was born, and over the years, the overgrown paths and decaying rides had turned it into something of a curiosity. Every once in a while, I would hear stories, some playful, some ominous, about what the park had become. But they were always just stories, right? That night, I decided to see it for myself. I wasn't alone, of course. A few of my friends had joined me, a small group, not too eager to venture out, but curious enough to humor me. There was Luke, the quiet one. He had this air about him, like he'd seen things that most people wouldn't believe. And then there was Cole, who was always looking for an adventure, no matter how reckless. I'm not one to shy away from things, but I'll admit, their personalities made me feel more at ease. If something did happen, I would have them by my side. Still, none of us were sure what we were stepping into. We made plans to head out after dark, because, well, what else is there to do on a weekend night? The moon was high, casting a silver glow across the city as we piled into Cole's old van. It creaked and groaned with every turn, but it was a reliable enough ride. The kind of vehicle you'd see in a horror movie, though none of us thought about that as we sped down the dark roads, our excitement growing. As we approached the park, the trees grew denser and the streetlights became fewer. The roads were less traveled, and soon we found ourselves surrounded by nothing but the thickening night. There was something oddly peaceful about the drive, like we were drifting into another world. The park's entrance was unmarked, just a rusted gate that had long since stopped serving its purpose. Cole slowed the van as we neared. I could see the outline of the Ferris wheel in the distance, its once bright colors now faded and swallowed by shadows. The towering structure looked less like an attraction and more like a ghostly monument to the past. When the van stopped, we all sat still for a moment, taking in the eerie silence. There was no sign of life, no distant chatter, just the faint sound of the wind rustling the leaves. "Is this it?" Luke asked, his voice steady but filled with that undercurrent of curiosity. "This is it," Cole replied, his grin wide, showing no hint of hesitation. "Let's go see what it's all about." We all stepped out of the van, the cool air biting in my skin. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, the concrete cracked and overgrown with weeds. It was as if the park had been swallowed up by time, forgotten and left to rot. We walked toward the entrance, which was little more than an archway now, the word Wonderworld barely legible on the decaying sign. It hung crooked above us, barely clinging to the rusted posts. "Kind of creepy," I muttered under my breath, but none of us seemed too concerned. We were here now, and backing out didn't feel like an option. Inside, the park was even more desolate. The roller coaster tracks twisted in unnatural directions, their once smooth lines now contorted and rusting. The old bumper car arena stood silent. The cars gathered in haphazard circles. The paint on the merry-go-round had chipped away, revealing bare metal beneath. Everything was stuck in a state of decay, like the world had simply stopped moving the moment the gates were locked all those years ago. As we ventured further, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. But that wasn't an odd thought. I figured it was just the atmosphere, the way the wind made the trees sway and the creaking of the old rides. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone standing just beyond the shadows, a figure waiting in the dark. We made our way toward the Ferris wheel, and that's when the first strange thing happened. The sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as we drew closer to the Ferris wheel, I began to hear something else, a soft, mechanical hum, like the faintest movement. It didn't make sense. The Ferris wheel was long out of order, nothing more than an eerie silhouette against the sky. "I don't like this," Luke muttered, his voice quieter than before. "Relax," Cole laughed. "It's just some old equipment, nothing to worry about." But there was something unsettling about the sound. It wasn't quite right. Then it stopped. For a moment, everything was still again, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. I let out a breath, trying to shake off the tension that had crept into my chest. But as we continued, I couldn't help but feel like we were no longer alone. That's when we noticed the gate near the old haunted house ride. It was open. The ride itself had been abandoned for years, and yet the gate was ajar, swinging slightly as if someone had just passed through. We all stopped in our tracks, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "Did we leave that open?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Everyone exchanged looks, and I could see the doubt in their eyes. None of us had opened it, but the gate was wide enough for someone to slip through. Suddenly, that creeping feeling, the one I had been trying to ignore, settled over me with a sense of finality. Something wasn't right here. We were no longer alone. And as we walked towards the haunted house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being led into something far more sinister than we had ever imagined. We stood there for a moment, frozen at the threshold of the haunted house broken down gate. The faint noise of the Ferris wheel had already faded, replaced by an uneasy silence that settled in around us like a thick fog. It was the kind of quiet that made you second-guess your every move, the kind that made your heart race, even though nothing had happened yet. We stood there, unsure of what to do next, our curiosity pulling us forward despite the growing sense that we were being watched. The old house ride loomed before us, its structure sagging under the weight of years of abandonment. The faded sign above the entrance read, "The House of Fear," but the only thing it seemed to hold now was a collection of old, dusty rides and broken windows. It looked like something straight out of a nightmare, a place that had outlived its purpose, but never really disappeared from people's minds. "Is this the part where we turn back?" Luke asked, his voice tight, betraying the unease he was trying to mask. Cole, always the daring one, shrugged and pushed open the creaky gate without a second thought. "It's just an old ride. What's the worst that could happen?" I didn't say anything, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach grew heavier. I knew I should have spoken up, that maybe we should have left when we still had the chance. But instead, we all followed Cole into the darkness, our footsteps echoing in the empty space around us. The house loomed in front of us, its windows dark and vacant. As we stepped inside, the air grew colder. It was subtle at first, just a drop in temperature that made me zip up my jacket a little more tightly. But the further we walked, the colder it became. It was as if the building itself was holding on to an unnatural chill, something that didn't belong in the warm night air. The first thing that hit me as we entered the darkened ride area was the smell. It wasn't the familiar scent of old wood or dust, no. This smelled different, musty, but with a metallic tang that hung in the air, making me cough involuntarily. It was the kind of smell you'd associate with something forgotten, left to decay. I tried to push it out of my mind as we wandered deeper inside. As we explored, we found remnants of the ride's former self, old rusting props that once had been part of the show. There were decaying mannequin figures that seemed to stare blankly at us from behind the broken windows. Their faces, once painted with eerie smiles or grotesque expressions, had faded away, leaving only empty, lifeless eyes. Their bodies were tattered, half-rotten, and yet I couldn't help but feel that they were watching us, waiting for something. I stopped in front of one of the old figureheads, the cracked paint giving it a grotesque appearance. Its eyes were missing, just dark sockets that seemed to mock me. My fingers twitched, wanting to reach out and touch it, but I resisted the urge. The place felt too wrong to risk getting too close to anything. "That thing gives me the creeps," I muttered under my breath. Luke nodded, glancing at it uneasily. "Yeah, it's like it's not supposed to be here." As we walked deeper into the haunted house, the air grew thicker with a sense of discomfort. I tried to shake it off, but something about the place felt like it was closing in on us. The walls seemed to breathe with us, expanding and contracting, as if the building itself were alive, suffocating us with its oppressive presence. I glanced over at Luke, whose face had gone pale, his eyes scanning the shadows like he was looking for something. Or someone. "Cole," Luke said quietly, "this place is messing with my head." Cole, ever the optimist, just laughed, though there was a forced edge to it. "You're just being paranoid. It's just an old ride." I wasn't so sure. Something in the back of my mind told me that whatever we were walking through, it wasn't just old amusement park debris. I had this sinking feeling that we were trespassing on something far older than the rides and more dangerous than the peeling paint suggested. We continued on, deeper into the maze of old rooms and narrow hallways. At first, the darkness was comforting, a familiar void in which nothing could sneak up on us. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a sound, a soft scraping noise. It was faint at first, just the slightest shift of something. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the wind, or maybe just the building settling. But as we continued walking, the sound followed us. It wasn't random either. It felt deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving in the darkness, keeping pace with us. I stopped in my tracks, listening intently. It was like a slow, deliberate scraping sound against wood or metal, coming from just beyond the shadows. I looked at the others, but no one had heard it yet. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered, my throat dry. Luke gave me a confused look. "Hear what?" "Something's following us," I said, my voice barely a murmur. Cole, ever the skeptic, scoffed and waved it off. "Probably just a rat or something." "You're scaring yourself." But I wasn't so sure. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just out of sight, watching us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I fought the urge to turn and run. But something kept me planted in place, as if I was waiting for the inevitable. We kept walking, but the scraping sound was still there, just out of sight. Every now and then, it would stop, and for a brief second, I would feel a sense of relief. But then it would start again, just loud enough to make my heart race. We made our way into what seemed like the center of the ride. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, twisting shadows against the walls. The entire place seemed to shift and change with every step, like it was rearranging itself behind our backs. And then, as I looked around, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, just at the edge of the light, stood a figure. It was tall, dressed in dark, tattered clothing. Its face was obscured by a hood, and it didn't move. It just stood there, staring at us. I froze, unable to breathe, unable to move. My mind screamed for me to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. "What the hell is that?" Luke finally asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. Cole, who had been laughing earlier, suddenly went silent. His face paled, and his usual bravado faltered. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. For a moment, The figure just stood there, motionless. And then, slowly, it started to move toward us. Step by slow step, it glided forward, its feet never seeming to touch the ground. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, as if something, or someone, was controlling me. The scraping noise grew louder now, closer, coming from all directions. It was as if the very walls were closing in, tightening around us with every step the figure took. The tension in the air was suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. One moment it was there, and the next, it had vanished into thin air. The scraping noise stopped immediately, leaving behind only the thick silence. We stood there, shaken to the core, unable to move. What had just happened? Had we all seen the same thing? I don't think I can do this anymore, Luke said, his voice barely a whisper. Let's get out of here. But before we could turn to leave, we heard something else. A low, groaning sound that echoed throughout the entire building. Something was coming, and we were no longer alone. We stood there, frozen in place, for what felt like an eternity. The air was thick with tension, and the silence that followed the figure's disappearance felt even more oppressive than the noises that had haunted us just moments ago. I could hear the faintest sound of my own breathing and the uneasy shuffle of feet as Luke and Cole exchanged nervous glances. We were all thinking the same thing, but none of us dared to voice it. What the hell was that? The darkness around us seemed to grow, pushing in like a living, breathing entity. The walls of the ride twisted in on themselves, every shadow now holding the possibility of something watching us. The low groaning sound that had come from deep within the building still lingered, reverberating through the floor and rattling the frames of the old ride. It was as if the very structure of the place was alive, groaning under its own weight, calling to us with a voice we couldn't understand. "We need to get out," Luke finally said, his voice tight with fear. "Now!" I looked around, but the exit we had come through wasn't visible anymore. The hallway that led us inside had somehow changed. The darkness felt deeper, more suffocating. My pulse quickened as I tried to orient myself, but everything felt wrong. The layout of the ride had shifted, the narrow hallways turning into maze-like corridors that led in every direction. There was no clear way out anymore. Cole, ever the one to keep pushing forward, took a step toward the hallway that seemed to lead further into the heart of the haunted house. "We've been here before," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We can find another way out. We just need to keep moving." I didn't trust him. I didn't trust any of it anymore. The world around us had stopped making sense. The strange figure we had seen earlier, the groaning building, and now this. This sensation that the very walls were moving, shifting, changing, closing in on us. I could feel it in my bones. "I don't think we should go deeper," I said, my voice shaking. "Something's not right. We should leave now." Luke nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I don't care what's in there. I just want to get out." But Cole was already walking ahead, ignoring our protests. "If we don't go further, we'll never find our way out. We need to keep going. It's the only way." He sounded so sure, so confident, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, that made me hesitate. I didn't want to be here anymore. The temperature in the building had dropped further, and I could feel the chill in my bones as I shivered, my breath coming out in visible puffs in the frigid air. We walked on, unsure of what awaited us next, but none of us was prepared for what would come. The first thing we noticed was the smell. It wasn't the usual stale air of abandonment. This was something else. Something much worse. It was the scent of decay, of rot. The metallic tang from earlier had returned, stronger now, mingling with the smell of dampness and mildew. My stomach churned, and I found myself gagging on the air. "Do you guys smell that?" I asked, my voice thick with disgust. Luke grimaced, covering his nose with his sleeve. "Yeah, it's awful." "What is that?" We kept moving, But now the sound of footsteps echoed in the silence behind us. Soft, deliberate steps. Not ours. Not anyone's. I stopped, glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Luke stopped, his eyes scanning the hallway behind us. "What do you mean?" "I don't hear anything. I swear I heard footsteps," I said, my throat tightening. Like someone was following us. Cole gave me an annoyed look. "You're just hearing things. Let's keep moving." But I couldn't shake the feeling. Every step we took, it felt like something else was moving too. Every creak of the floor, every rustle in the walls, seemed to echo with the presence of something unseen, something that was with us, watching us. We pressed on, our every step becoming more cautious, more deliberate. The sounds of the building seemed to intensify. The groans of the walls were louder now, accompanied by the faint creaking of old machinery that had long since stopped functioning. It was as if the entire ride, the entire building, was alive with something we couldn't comprehend. Then, something shifted in the corner of my eye. I glanced quickly to the left, and there it was, the shadow. A figure, moving just beyond the light. It was fleeting, just a glimpse, but it was enough to send a shock through me. The shadow was tall, distorted, its limbs long and unnatural. It wasn't just a trick of the light, it was moving, slipping between the cracks of the ride, its form bending in ways that didn't make sense. "Did you see that?" I asked urgently, my voice rising with panic. "What?" Luke asked, spinning around. "What did you see?" I couldn't point to it, it was gone as soon as it appeared. But the air had changed again, thickening with a sense of dread that pressed in on us from all sides. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Forget it," Cole said, brushing past me. "We need to keep going." But as he walked ahead, the shadows seemed to shift around him, moving with an unsettling fluidity. It was as if the dark corners of the building were reaching for him, pulling him towards something that wasn't supposed to be there. I called out to him, but the words were swallowed by the growing silence, swallowed by the place itself. I hesitated, my eyes flicking from the darkness ahead to the darkness behind. It felt like the very air was pressing in on us, closing us off, as if we were no longer in control of our own movements. The walls felt like they were shifting again, like they were closing in on us. The narrow hallway we had been following now seemed to stretch on forever, the lights flickering overhead as though they were barely hanging on. And then, out of nowhere, a loud bang sounded from somewhere deep within the building. It wasn't like the groans we had been hearing. This was a forceful, jarring sound, like a door slamming shut or something heavy hitting the floor. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. "What was that?" Luke asked, his voice low and tight. Cole didn't answer. He was staring ahead, his face pale. The confidence he had carried with him earlier had disappeared, replaced by a look of fear I hadn't seen before. And then we heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. A voice, soft, faint, and distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't speaking to us. It wasn't even speaking in a language we could understand. It was just a string of muffled sounds, as if someone, or something, was trying to reach us, trapped within the walls of the building. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Luke nodded slowly, his eyes wide. "Yeah, it's coming from over there." We followed his gaze, and there, at the end of the hallway, was a door. It was ajar, the soft light spilling from within, revealing only the faintest outline of what lay beyond. The voice seemed to come from there, from that dark room at the end of the hall. Cole started toward it, but this time I couldn't follow. I had to stop. The tension in the air had become too much. The sense of being trapped, of being suffocated by the very building itself, was overwhelming. "Cole, don't," I pleaded, grabbing his arm. "We need to leave. Now." But Cole just looked at me, his face a mask of fear. "We can't leave." "Not yet. We have to figure out what's going on." I opened my mouth to argue, But the room at the end of the hallway groaned again, the sound deep and rattling. And then, just before I could speak, the door swung open. We weren't alone anymore. The door creaked open slowly, and a cold gust of air rushed out, sending shivers down my spine. It wasn't just the coldness that unnerved me, but the sheer weight of the silence that followed. The sound of our footsteps, once the only noise filling the air, now seemed distant, almost muted, as if the room beyond had its own gravity that pulled everything else into it. Luke was the first to step forward, his face pale but determined. Cole, following closely behind, looked equally intent on whatever waited beyond that door. I hesitated, my feet refusing to move as the darkness inside seemed to stretch further, devouring the little light that escaped from the corridor behind us. Something about the emptiness inside the room felt unnatural, as if it was waiting for us to step into it to complete some kind of twisted puzzle. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. But Cole didn't respond. He just nodded, eyes fixed on the shadows within. It was as though he could see something I couldn't. That feeling of being drawn towards something unknown was stronger now than ever. I glanced at Luke, who seemed to share the same apprehension, but neither of us could muster the courage to stop Cole. He was already halfway through the door, and the rest of us had no choice but to follow, our own steps dragging us forward despite our better instincts. The room beyond the door was not what I expected. It wasn't some dilapidated storage room or forgotten maintenance area like I had imagined. No, it was far worse than that. The walls were lined with old carnival props and machinery, their surfaces chipped and rusted, but what caught my attention was the central piece. A massive mirror stood in the middle of the room, framed in tarnished gold that reflected the dim light around it. But the mirror wasn't ordinary. It seemed to shimmer, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a breeze. And within it, I could swear I saw something moving. Luke was the first to speak. "What the hell is that?" Cole's eyes were fixed on the mirror, his voice barely audible. It's just a reflection." But it wasn't. I could see it clearly now. The figures in the mirror weren't just reflections of us. They were something else, something more. There were faces in the glass, pale, twisted, and contorted in expressions of agony, their eyes wide and pleading. The images flickered in and out of focus, and for a moment, I thought I saw a hand reaching out from the surface of the glass, its fingers stretching toward us. My heart thudded in my chest as I backed away, but the pull of the mirror was irresistible. "Get away from it!" I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the overwhelming sensation that seemed to come from the mirror itself, a deep, resonating hum that vibrated through my bones. I reached out to grab Cole's arm, but he was already moving toward the mirror, his face almost blank, as if in a trance. "Cole, stop!" I screamed, but it was too late. In one swift motion, Cole reached out and placed his hand against the glass, and that was when everything changed. The mirror rippled violently, the surface distorting as though the glass itself were alive, pulling him toward it. I could hear his breath catch in his throat, the sound of his hand slapping against the glass as though it were sticky, refusing to let go. His body jerked, as if caught in some kind of invisible force, and then, in a horrifying instant, the glass cracked. I didn't know what happened next. The world seemed to distort around me, everything spinning out of control. I could hear Luke yelling, but his voice sounded muffled, as if coming from underwater. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls bending and twisting as shadows swirled around us, moving like living things. And then, the scream. It wasn't Cole's voice. It wasn't anyone's. It came from the mirror, from the very depths of the shattered glass. A high-pitched, bone-chilling scream that reverberated through the room, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The sound seemed to echo from all directions, as if the walls themselves were screaming, as if the entire building was alive, mourning the lost souls trapped within. I tried to pull Cole back, but he was gone. The moment his hand made contact with the mirror, he had vanished. The space where he had stood was empty, The mirror, now calm and undisturbed, its surface smooth again, as though nothing had happened. But I knew, deep down, that something had. Something far worse than anything I could imagine. "Cole?" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. My voice cracked as I stumbled forward, desperate to find him. But there was nothing but the emptiness of the room, the eerie calm that followed the chaos. I was alone. No, 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 I whispered, my mind racing. This can't be happening. Luke was beside me now, his face a mask of terror. His eyes darted around the room, looking for any sign of Cole, but there was nothing. He's gone. He's gone. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I staggered backward, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands shook as I reached out for the mirror, but something stopped me. The mirror. It wasn't just a mirror. It was a portal, a gateway to something far darker than I could comprehend. And now it was taking us one by one. "We have to get out of here," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. And then I saw it. In the reflection, not just the twisted, contorted faces of those who had come before us, but Cole. His eyes were wide with fear, his body pressing against the surface of the glass, trying to claw his way out. But he was trapped. He couldn't move, his mouth open in a silent scream that echoed in my mind. "Cole!" I cried, my voice raw, desperate. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the mirror's surface. The moment my hand made contact, I felt it a coldness like nothing I had ever experienced before. It wasn't just cold, it was empty. A hollow, suffocating coldness that seemed to freeze my very soul. The mirror pulsed beneath my fingertips, and in an instant, I was no longer standing in the room. I was somewhere else. Somewhere. Dark. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see. I couldn't move. And then I heard it again. That voice. But this time, it wasn't a scream. It was a whisper, soft and chilling. "You're next." The world around me seemed to fold in on itself, and I felt the darkness closing in. Every breath was a struggle, every sound a nightmare. And then I knew there was no way out. Not for me, not for any of us. I was trapped. The mirror had claimed its prize. The world around me swirled, distorted like the broken reflections that had danced across the mirror's surface. My chest heaved with panic as I stumbled backward, trying to force myself back to the room I had just been in, the room with Luke and the now vanished Cole. But it felt as though I was moving through thick fog, every step I took pulling me deeper into some dark, intangible void. The air was cold, but it wasn't just a physical chill. It was something else, something that crawled beneath my skin, making my heart race and my breath come in short, desperate bursts. I had to get out. I had to find a way back. I reached out blindly, my fingers brushing against the invisible walls that seemed to encircle me. There was no door, no window, just darkness, thick and suffocating. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing added up. One moment I had been standing in that room with Luke and Cole, and now I was somewhere else entirely. The mirror. The mirror had taken Cole. It had taken us all, one by one, into this dark, endless space. And now I could hear Luke's voice again, faint but still audible, calling my name through the void. "Luke?" I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. But the darkness swallowed the sound. I didn't know how long I had been standing there, lost in the emptiness. It could have been minutes, or hours. Time had become irrelevant in this place. I could hear Luke, his voice growing more frantic now, as though he were trapped here too, just out of reach. His calls echoed in my ears, and I tried to follow the sound, my legs shaking beneath me as I moved toward the direction it came from. "Luke!" I shouted this time, my voice stronger, more desperate. And then I saw it. The faintest glimmer of light, just ahead. It wasn't much, barely noticeable at first, but it was enough to drive me forward. I didn't know what it was or where it led, but it felt like the only thing tethering me to reality. It felt like hope. With every step, the light grew stronger, revealing itself to be a narrow crack in the air, like a seam in the fabric of the darkness, barely perceptible, but real. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling as I reached for it. The darkness around me seemed to shift and pulse, as though it were alive, trying to drag me back into the void. But I couldn't stop. I had to get out. I had to escape. I pushed my hand through the crack, and as soon as I did, the world around me fractured. The darkness shattered like glass, and I felt myself falling, my body weightless, tumbling through an endless void. My stomach lurched, and for a brief moment, I thought I was going to lose consciousness. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sensation stopped. I was on solid ground again. I opened my eyes. I was back in the room with a mirror. The mirror that had stolen Cole and sent me into that nightmare. My head was spinning, and I felt nauseous, disoriented. I staggered to my feet, my hands trembling as I looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. The mirror still stood there, in the center of the room, as though it had never moved. But this time, it wasn't shimmering or pulsating. It was still, silent. I wasn't sure if I had truly escaped, if this was real or just another part of the nightmare. But I had to find out. I had to know if Luke was still here, or if he had vanished as well. Luke? My voice was raw now, but it carried the same desperate tone as before. I turned around, scanning the room. And there, in the corner, I saw him. Luke was standing by the far wall, his back to me, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he had been through the same experience I had, his eyes wide with fear, his body trembling. Luke? I repeated, my voice a whisper now. He turned slowly, and when our eyes met, I could see it, the same fear, the same confusion that I felt. But there was something else there too, something deeper, something I couldn't quite place. His gaze flickered to the mirror, and then back to me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, taking in the reality of what had just happened. "We're out," he said finally, his voice hoarse, as though the words themselves hurt to speak. "But, Cole," I swallowed hard, the name a painful reminder of what we had lost. We had come here together, the three of us, and now only two of us remained. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. Luke's expression softened as he looked at me, his eyes searching mine. What? What do we do now? I didn't have an answer. Part of me wanted to believe that we could just walk out of here, that everything would go back to normal, that we could forget this twisted experience. But I knew that wasn't possible. The mirror was still there, still waiting, still calling. It wasn't finished with us yet. It hadn't taken everything it wanted. "We leave," I said, finally finding my voice. My words were shaky, but they were firm. "We get out of here. We don't come back." Luke nodded, his face still pale, but there was a sense of relief in his eyes. We weren't trapped in that place anymore, but we both knew that we would never be the same. The horrors we had witnessed would stay with us, haunting our thoughts, twisting our memories. The things we had seen, what had happened to Cole, could never be erased. We made our way to the door, every step heavy with the weight of what we had experienced. I opened it, the cool night air rushing in, carrying with it the distant sounds of the world beyond the world that felt so far away now, as if we were returning from some other reality. We stepped outside, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp night air. We had made it out. But as we walked away, the memory of that mirror stayed with me. The faces, the voices, the feeling of something reaching out from beyond. I didn't know what we had disturbed, what ancient thing we had uncovered in that abandoned theme park, but I knew this. We had barely escaped with our lives. And in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror wasn't done with us. Not yet. I glanced at Luke, and for a moment, our eyes met again. We didn't need to say anything more. We both knew that the nightmare wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And as we walked further away, I couldn't help but feel a chill on the back of my neck, as if someone or something was still watching us, following us, waiting. But for now, all I could do was keep moving forward, hoping that the darkness we had left behind would stay there. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. We had escaped. But what if it wasn't over? What if we were only beginning to understand what had happened? The unanswered questions gnawed at my thoughts, and neither would Luke. As days passed, I tried to convince myself that the worst was over. That night, those strange hours spent in that abandoned theme park had to be some twisted figment of my imagination. It had felt real, yes, but surely it was nothing more than a nightmare, a dark experience rooted in fear and adrenaline. But as much as I tried to ignore the thoughts, the gnawing sensation, the whispers in the back of my mind, they wouldn't let me go. Luke and I never spoke about that night again, not in any meaningful way. We both knew we had witnessed something unspeakable, something beyond reason, and neither of us had the words to describe it. How do you explain to someone that a mirror, just a mirror, could pull you into another world, that it could trap you in darkness, tear you apart piece by piece, and steal everything you love? We tried to move on, to return to our normal lives, but the echoes of that night lingered in the corners of my thoughts. I found myself staring into every mirror I passed, wondering if something was watching me from behind the glass. The once mundane act of looking into a reflective surface now filled me with dread. Would I see something that shouldn't be there? A shadow? A face? And I, watching, waiting? I would never be able to look at a mirror the same way again. Luke seemed to be coping in his own way, though I could see the same unease in his eyes, the same distant look when he thought no one was watching. He still joked about the experience sometimes, as if trying to pretend it hadn't really happened. But it was different now. The laughter didn't sound the same, and his jokes lacked the warmth they once held. They felt hollow. We continued our lives, but there was a shift, a subtle fracture in our reality. The night seemed longer, colder, and each time I closed my eyes to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by something I couldn't explain. Sometimes I thought I could hear Luke calling out to me in the dark, his voice faint, desperate, as if he were still stuck in that other world, that nightmare we'd escaped from. But it was when I went to the old theme park, months later, that the truth began to reveal itself. Luke had insisted on coming with me, his face tight with fear, though he wouldn't admit it. We had to know what had happened to Cole, and we needed to understand what that mirror had really been. Was it just a twisted relic from a forgotten time, or had we stumbled onto something far more sinister? The park was in even worse condition now, its rusting skeleton more haunting than before. The remnants of broken rides, overgrown pathways, and crumbling structures loomed before us, casting eerie shadows. We walked cautiously, every step heavy with the weight of the past. It felt like the place itself was alive, like it remembered us, as if it had been waiting for our return. We approached the old funhouse, the one we had explored before, where the mirror had first taken us. The door was ajar, creaking on its hinges, as though it, too, was reluctant to let us in. A cold wind swept through the air, and the darkness seemed to shift in anticipation. "Are you sure about this?" Luke asked, his voice low and uncertain. "Maybe it's better we just leave it alone." I looked at him, torn between the need for answers and the overwhelming fear that was clawing at my insides. But I had to know. I had to understand what we had experienced. I had to know if the nightmare was still out there, waiting. "We need to see it for ourselves," I said, my voice firm despite the fear twisting my gut. We stepped inside, the creaking of the floorboards sounding too loud in the silence. The air was thick, heavy with dust and the weight of forgotten memories. We moved through the decaying halls, past mirrors that reflected only our shadows, as if the glass was reluctant to show us anything more. The air felt thick, oppressive, like we were intruding on something ancient. And then we found it. The mirror. It was just as we had left it, standing there in the corner, untouched, as if frozen in time. It was larger than I remembered, and the edges were jagged, like cracks running through the very fabric of reality. The mirror seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if it were alive, waiting for something or someone. Luke and I stood there, staring at it. I could feel the pull of it, the same pull that had taken us before. It beckoned, calling to me, though I didn't know why. My heart raced, and I took a step closer, my hand reaching toward the glass. Luke grabbed my wrist before I could touch it. "Don't," he whispered, his grip tight. "We don't know what it is. We don't know what it can do." But it was too late. The moment my fingers brushed against the mirror, the world seemed to shudder. The floor beneath us trembled, and the lights flickered as if something from the other side was trying to break through. I could hear it again, Cole's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling out to us from within the mirror. "Cole?" I breathed, my voice trembling. There was no answer, only the deafening silence of the room. But I knew he was still there, trapped, still lost, still calling for us. And that was when I understood the truth. The mirror wasn't just a relic. It wasn't a forgotten piece of the park. It was something much darker, something older. A doorway, perhaps, or a prison. And we had opened it, unwittingly, when we had first stepped inside this place. Luke and I backed away slowly, but the pull of the mirror remained, a constant, insistent tug. We turned and fled, not looking back. The echoes of our footsteps were drowned out by the deafening roar of wind, the sound of something ancient stirring, something awakening. We didn't speak as we ran. There was nothing more to say. We didn't need to discuss what we had learned or what we had seen. We both understood that it wasn't over. The mirror wasn't done with us, not by a long shot. It still had Cole, and perhaps it would come for us again someday. Or maybe we had already been marked, our souls imprinted on the very surface of the glass. We left the park behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, waiting for us to return. And though we made it back to our lives, part of me knew we were never truly free. The mirror had taken something from us, and no matter how far we ran, we would never escape its grasp. That's the thing about fear, it never truly lets go. It lingers like a shadow in the corner of your mind, a dark reflection that never fades. And every time I pass the mirror, I feel that same unsettling pull, as if something is waiting on the other side. It was a warm summer evening when I first heard about the place. I was sitting in my usual spot, a cozy corner in a quiet cafe, catching up with a few friends. We'd just wrapped up a long day of work, and after all the hours in front of the computer screen, I was in desperate need of some fresh air and a break from the usual routine. At that point, I wasn't looking for anything out of the ordinary, just a peaceful trip somewhere, something to recharge my batteries. That's when Alex, an old friend from college, brought up the idea of a road trip. The kind of road trip where you just get in the car, pick a direction, and let the journey unfold. We'd been friends for years, but this was something we hadn't done since college. The thought of hitting the road again, no set destination in mind, felt liberating. We need to just get away, man. We've been stuck in the same routine for way too long, Alex said as he leaned back in his chair, his voice filled with excitement. There's this place I heard about. A town, actually. It's off the beaten path, and hardly anyone goes there. Curiosity piqued, I leaned in. A town? You mean like a ghost town? I asked, half joking, half serious. The idea of exploring some forgotten, desolate place sounded intriguing. Not exactly. But yeah, something like that, Alex replied, his eyes narrowing as if he was trying to recall every detail. It's a town that was abandoned years ago, but they say the buildings are still standing. People say weird stuff happens there too. My first thought was that it sounded like one of those abandoned places people go to for the thrill. But as Alex continued, he mentioned how little was known about the place, and that only a few people still live nearby. too distant to talk to, too wary to share much. Intrigued by the idea, I agreed without hesitation. We could head there, check it out, take a few pictures, and be on our way. Just a quick escape from the grind, nothing more. The next morning, we packed up the essentials: water, snacks, a couple of old cameras, and a few maps of places we thought we might explore. Our plan was simple: drive out into the countryside, find this forgotten town, and spend the day exploring it a couple of hours into the drive. I remember thinking about how freeing it felt, being out on the road with no set schedule, no emails to check, no deadlines hanging over our heads. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, we were miles from the nearest city, surrounded by open roads and fields stretching endlessly on both sides. The landscape was peaceful, quiet, almost idyllic. It was the kind of serenity that made you feel like you could truly escape from the world. We were passing through a small rural area when the town Alex mentioned came up on the map. It was situated deep in the woods, far enough off the main roads that it was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The name of the town was Ashfield, and it looked like it had been there for decades, untouched and forgotten. We could feel the air change as we turned off the paved roads and onto the dirt path that led toward Ashfield. The mood shifted slightly, as if the world around us was holding its breath, waiting for something. We didn't know it yet, but the quiet sense of isolation that settled over us wasn't going to stay peaceful for long. The further we drove into the wilderness, the more the trees seemed to close in on us, casting long shadows over the road. The deepening twilight, combined with the lack of other cars, made the whole place feel off. As we reached the outskirts of Ashfield, the first thing that struck me was the silence. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no sounds at all except for the hum of the engine. The buildings that lined the main street were tall and old, their facades weathered with time. Some were crumbling, their windows shattered, while others still had remnants of life, faded signs, and empty storefronts. We parked the car near the center of town, not really sure what to expect. The silence was unnerving. Not a single person was around, and the streets, despite their wear and tear, seemed eerily clean, as if someone had been keeping them in some kind of odd maintenance. I stepped out of the car, and the moment my foot hit the ground, it felt different, like stepping into a place that didn't belong in the present. Alex was already out of the car, taking pictures of the rundown buildings. "Man, this is crazy," he muttered, snapping a shot of an old clock tower that had long since stopped working. He was visibly excited by the place, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. We wandered further into the town, exploring the decaying buildings and looking for signs of the people who once lived there. There was a sense of abandonment, of course, but also an odd stillness. Everything felt suspended in time, as if the world outside had forgotten this place entirely. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the town, we had made our way to the edge of the main street. There, a small sign that had been weathered by time caught my attention. It was old and faded, but just legible enough to read. "Welcome to Ashfield. Keep to the path." I didn't know it yet, but that was the first warning. The sun had nearly set by the time we reached the heart of Ashfield. The twilight bathed the ghost town in a muted golden way, but there was something about the way the light seemed to cling to the buildings, casting shadows in odd directions, that made the whole place feel different. We stood there for a moment, absorbing the scene in front of us. The air was thick with stillness, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. "Okay, this place is kind of weird," I said, breaking the silence. Alex, still enthusiastic, was already snapping photos with his old camera, seemingly undeterred by the strange vibe. He didn't seem to notice the way the wind had picked up, or the way the temperature dropped just as we entered the town. "Yeah, but that's what makes it interesting, right? I mean, look at this place." Alex gestured toward the old, decrepit buildings with a smile, not fully aware of the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the street, as if they were reaching toward us. "We're probably the first ones to be here in years. This is untouched, I didn't argue, but something in me didn't feel right. I glanced over at the buildings again, rubble, dust, and abandoned storefronts, but still no signs of life. It was as if everyone had vanished in the blink of an eye. "Let's check out the old diner," Alex suggested. "Maybe there's something interesting inside." The diner was one of the only buildings that still had some of its original features. The faded neon sign above the door flickered weakly in the growing darkness, casting an eerie glow onto the cracked pavement. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years, but the door creaked open without resistance when Alex pushed it. As we stepped inside, the scent of stale air and dust hit us. The place was as untouched as the rest of the town, but this time there was something more. The tables were set, silverware neatly arranged, and the chairs were all perfectly aligned. It was as if someone had been expecting us. Or maybe it was just the weird, unsettling stillness of the place that made it seem so odd. I moved toward the counter, running my fingers along the old wood, which felt strangely warm, like it had been used recently. "This is creepy, man," I muttered under my breath. But Alex, ever the explorer, was already moving toward the back of the diner. "There's an old kitchen back there. Let's see what's inside." The closer we got to the back, the more the silence seemed to deepen. Every step I took echoed loudly in the emptiness, amplifying the sense of isolation. The walls, once bright with chipped paint and posters of long-forgotten meals, were now covered with grime and decay. The old jukebox sat in the corner, but it was silent. Alex pulled open a door leading to the kitchen. He stepped in first, and I followed reluctantly. The air in here was heavy, thick with the smell of old grease and dust. But it was more than just that the temperature felt unnaturally cold, like we had stepped into a freezer. "Why is it so cold in here?" I asked, rubbing my arms for warmth. Alex shrugged. "Probably just the old place. It's not exactly weatherproof." I didn't respond, but the cold was unsettling. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the way the air felt stagnant, as if it had been sitting there for years without any movement. We both stood there for a moment, absorbing the quiet. Then I heard it. A soft creak. The faintest sound, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere deep inside the diner. It wasn't the wind, which had died down outside. It wasn't the house settling either. It was more like a door opening slowly, deliberately. I looked at Alex, who hadn't noticed. He was busy fiddling with something on the counter, trying to figure out if any of the equipment still worked. The creak came again, louder this time. My heart skipped a beat. I took a step forward, glancing around, but I couldn't see anyone. The diner was still empty, at least. It seemed empty. "Alex," I called quietly, trying not to sound too panicked. "Did you hear that?" Alex didn't respond. He was lost in whatever he was doing with the kitchen equipment. I took a few steps forward, my eyes scanning the room. The creak came again, but this time it was accompanied by a soft shuffle, like something or someone was moving in the shadows behind the counter. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The shadows behind the counter stretched unnaturally long, and I could swear I saw something shift within them, something that didn't belong. "Alex," I whispered urgently, my voice trembling. "Let's go. We need to leave." This time, Alex looked up, distracted. "What's wrong?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I stepped toward the door, my pulse quickening. I could still feel the presence in the diner, the sensation of being watched, even though I couldn't see anyone. There was something wrong in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "We're leaving," I said firmly, gripping his arm and pulling him toward the door. Reluctantly, Alex followed me outside, muttering about how it was just an old building, but I could tell that the chill in the air had affected him too. His voice had a slight tremor, his movements hurried. The moment we stepped outside, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift, and I let out a shaky breath, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. We didn't talk much as we walked down the street, both of us lost in our thoughts. It wasn't until we reached the car that I dared to look back at the diner. The sign flickered again, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw a figure in the window. I quickly turned away, gripping the door handle as I jumped into the driver's seat. Alex climbed in next to me, his face pale. Without a word, I started the engine and pulled away from the diner, eager to leave Ashfield behind. But as we drove further into the heart of the town, something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. A shadow, a figure, and then it was gone. I didn't say anything at first. I wasn't sure what I had seen, but the chill that had followed us from the diner still clung to the air. Did you see that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex turned to me, his eyes wide with confusion. See what? I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because I knew, deep down, that whatever we had just felt wasn't just the result of an old building, or a draft, or the wind. There was something more to Ashfield, something darker, and it wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. We were barely an hour out of Ashfield, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us. The road ahead stretched on, empty and devoid of life, but the weight of Ashfield lingered in the air like a thick fog. Every now and then, I'd glance at Alex, who seemed lost in his thoughts. He hadn't said much since we left the diner, his usual upbeat demeanor replaced by a quiet unease. I couldn't blame him. I was feeling it too. The headlights of the car cut through the dark, illuminating the road ahead. A couple of times, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows, a flash of white. But when I looked closer, there was nothing. I wasn't sure if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or if there was something else out there. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow from the diner. But the road behind us was empty, nothing but dark, endless forest on either side. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. I felt like we were being followed, like eyes were on us from the darkness. What do you think was in the diner? I finally asked, breaking the silence. My voice felt too loud in the stillness of the car. Alex shrugged, his fingers drumming nervously on the window. I don't know, man. It's probably just some weird old building. You're overthinking it. But even as he said it, I could tell he wasn't convinced. He looked over at me, his face pale under the dim light of the dashboard. Maybe we should just get out of here, leave the town behind for good. I didn't argue. I had the same thought running through my mind. But there was a part of me, the part that wanted to understand, that couldn't let it go. Something was wrong in Ashfield, something beyond just the emptiness of an abandoned town. We drove for another hour in silence, the sound of the tires on the road, the only thing breaking the quiet. It wasn't until we passed a small crossroads that things started to get weirder. The first thing I noticed was the sign. It was old, rusty, and half buried in the overgrown grass, but I could still make out the words, Ashfield 5 miles. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart skipping a beat. 5 miles? We had already passed Ashfield. We had already left it behind. My mind raced. How could we still be that close? Did you see that? I asked, my voice shaky. The sign. It said Ashfield was 5 miles away. Alex looked up from his phone, furrowing his brow. What are you talking about? We passed Ashfield 20 minutes ago. I turned the car around, my hands suddenly clammy. We need to go back, I said, my voice urgent. Alex looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling us back, that we weren't supposed to leave so easily. The road twisted and turned in unnatural ways as I drove back toward Ashfield. The headlights seemed to flicker every now and then, casting the trees on the side of the road in eerie, distorted shapes. The silence in the car felt suffocating. I couldn't tell if it was the weight of the past few hours or something else entirely. It felt like the air was thick, like it was pressing in on us from all sides. When we finally reached the outskirts of Ashfield again, the town looked different. The buildings, once faded and decrepit, now looked as though they were freshly abandoned, like they had been waiting for us to return. The streets were empty, the only sound, the distant hum of the winds. "I don't like this," Alex said, his voice trembling. "We should have just left. There's something off about this place." "I know," I replied, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. "But I need to know what's going on here. Something's not right." We parked near the diner again, but this time, the place seemed even more alive, as if it were waiting for us to return. The neon sign flickered to life, casting a sickly glow on the cracked pavement. It was the only thing illuminated in the entire town, as if the rest of Ashfield was shrouded in darkness. The air felt heavier now, more oppressive, and I could swear I heard something moving in the distance, faint but unmistakable. "What is that sound?" Alex asked, his voice low. I turned off the engine and listened carefully. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but it was there, a rhythmic tapping, like something or someone was moving in the distance. "I don't know," I said, my throat dry, "but we need to find out." We stepped out of the car cautiously, both of us looking around, trying to make sense of the sudden tension that seemed to have gripped the town. The tapping noise came again, this time louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the old church at the far end of the street. I glanced at Alex, who looked just as uneasy as I felt. "We should check it out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex hesitated, but then nodded. We began walking down the street, the sound of our footsteps, the only thing breaking the eerie silence. The tapping grew louder as we neared the church, until it was almost deafening. It was coming from inside. When we reached the church doors, they were wide open, the hinges creaking in the wind. We stood there for a moment, both of us frozen, staring into the dark interior. The air inside felt colder than outside, and there was a faint smell of decay. I was about to step forward when I heard it soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. A voice. A whisper, but not from inside the church. It was coming from behind us. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. Just the empty street, bathed in the sickly glow of the diner's neon light. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Alex didn't respond. He was already walking toward the church, his curiosity getting the best of him. I followed reluctantly, my senses on high alert, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. The whispering wasn't stopping. In fact, it seemed to be getting closer, more persistent, as if someone was following us. Inside the church, it was darker than I had expected. The few rays of moonlight that had made their way through the cracked windows only served to cast long, distorted shadows across the pews. The smell of mildew and decay hung heavy in the air, making it hard to breathe. The tapping sound was louder now, reverberating through the building, bouncing off the walls. It was coming from somewhere deep inside, from the altar. We moved forward cautiously, the sound of our footsteps too loud in the quiet space. But as we neared the altar, something caught my eye, a figure, standing motionless at the far end of the church, shrouded in darkness. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. "Alex, do you see that?" I whispered. Alex turned toward the figure, his face suddenly drained of color. But as he stepped forward to get a closer look, the figure vanished, like smoke in the wind. "Get out of here," I said urgently, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the door. I didn't wait to see if he was following. I just ran. We burst out of the church into the night air, gasping for breath, both of us shaken. The whispering stopped immediately, but the feeling of being watched didn't. We didn't speak as we rushed back to the car, neither of us wanting to acknowledge what we had just seen. As I started the engine and pulled away from the church, I glanced in the rearview mirror. And there, standing in the doorway of the church, was the figure again, watching us. This time, I didn't look away. We were speeding down the road again, but the air felt different now. The silence in the car was palpable, thick, almost suffocating. The headlights flickered once more as the trees on either side of the road seemed to lean in, closer than they had before. The forest around Ashfield was dense, a thick wall of shadows that felt like they were closing in on us. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see that figure from the church following us, its empty gaze fixed on the back of the car. Alex didn't speak. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tight as he stared out the window, his hands gripping the seat as though he could hold on to something real to stop the world from unraveling around him. We didn't talk about what happened in the church. Neither of us wanted to. The image of the figure motionless, watching us, its presence heavy in the air, was burned into my mind, and I knew it was the same for Alex. I had to remind myself to keep driving, to focus on the road, but something in my gut told me it was pointless. We could drive for miles, but I didn't know if we could outrun whatever it was that had already marked us. Ashfield wasn't just a town. It wasn't just an abandoned place stuck in time. It was something else, something older and darker, and it wasn't going to let us leave. The tension in the car was unbearable. The hum of the engine, the rhythmic thump of the tires against the cracked asphalt, these were the only sounds in the otherwise dead world around us. And then, just as we neared the end of the road that led out of Ashfield, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, just ahead of us. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just inches from the figure. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment, I didn't know if I was breathing at all. "Alex," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my chest. He was already frozen, his eyes wide with fear, his mouth moving but no words coming out. He was staring at the figure too, his face reflecting the same shock and disbelief I was feeling. The figure didn't move. It stood there, motionless, in the middle of the road, blocking our path. It wasn't like the figure from the church. This one was real. Solid. Human. But something was wrong about it. The way it stood still, the way its head was slightly tilted as if it was studying us, made my skin crawl. I didn't know if I should get out of the car or if I should just drive right through it. But then, the figure took a step forward, and I could see it clearly. It was a man at least. That's what it looked like at first. He was tall, his frame broad and imposing, but his face was wrong. There was no expression, no emotion in his features. His skin was unnaturally pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in years, and his eyes, they were black. Not just dark, but completely black pools of emptiness that seemed to swallow the light around them. Alex gasped, his hands shooting out to grab my arm. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my throat dry. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was like a magnet pulling me in, and I could feel the pull deep in my chest. The figure took another step forward, and that was when I noticed something even more disturbing. There was no sound, no footsteps. It was like he was gliding across the road, silently, effortlessly. "Please don't," Alex begged, his voice breaking. He was shaking now, his face pale, his hands trembling. He wasn't just scared, he was terrified. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was getting closer, too close, and I didn't know what to do. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to think clearly. The only thing I could do was stare at him, at the blackness in his eyes. And then, in a sudden flash, the figure was gone. 1 second, he was there, standing in front of us, and the next, he was simply not. It was like he evaporated into thin air, disappearing into the night. I didn't say anything at first. I couldn't. I was still processing what I had just seen. My heart was racing, my mind scrambled, trying to make sense of what just happened. But there was no sense to it. Nothing about this made sense. "We need to get out of here," Alex said, his voice desperate. He looked at me, his eyes wide, his breath coming in short gasps. "We have to go, now." I didn't argue. I threw the car in reverse, slamming my foot on the pedal as we sped backward, away from the place where the figure had been. The headlights cut through the night, but I didn't feel any safer. The feeling of being watched, of something following us, never left. As we turned the car around and headed back down the road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure again. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind us, stretching out into the dark, endless forest. Then I heard it. A sound so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it. But it grew louder, clearer. A whisper. "No," I muttered under my breath, shaking my head. I couldn't hear it, but it was there, just beyond the edge of hearing. The whisper grew louder still, until it was all I could hear, a constant presence in the car, surrounding me, pressing in on me. It was a voice, no, many voices, all speaking at once. And they were speaking to us. "Get out, get out." The words were unmistakable. A command, an order. "Get out," Alex whispered, as if in a trance. He wasn't looking at me anymore. His eyes were fixed ahead, glazed over. His voice sounded distant, like he was hearing the whispers too, and it was taking control of him. I tried to snap him out of it. "Alex, snap out of it. We need to keep moving." But he didn't respond. He was completely entranced by the voice, his eyes empty, his mouth moving as though he was speaking to someone who wasn't there. "Get out, get out." His voice became a chant, growing louder, more frantic. I slammed my fist on the steering wheel, trying to shake him out of it. "Alex, listen to me. This isn't real. This is just in your head." But it wasn't just in my head. The whispering was real. It was in the car, in the air around us, filling the space with its oppressive presence. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the whispering stopped. Alex snapped back to reality, blinking rapidly as if he were waking from a deep sleep. He looked at me, confusion and terror filling his eyes. "What? What happened? What did I?" I didn't have time to answer. The car lurched, its tires screeching on the road. I slammed my foot on the brake, trying to stop it, but the car kept moving, kept sliding forward, as if something invisible was pushing us. The wheel jerked in my hands, pulling us off course, heading straight for the edge of the road. "No, no, no," I shouted, trying to control the car, but it was hopeless. The road had disappeared beneath us, and we were heading for the trees. I braced for impact, but just before we hit, everything went dark. The last thing I heard was a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Get out." And then, nothing. "Alex," I said quietly, afraid of what I might find. I reached over, my hand trembling as I touched his arm. He was still sitting next to me, motionless, and I feared that I might be too late. He didn't answer. I leaned closer, trying to check for signs of life, but the darkness seemed to suffocate all sense of reality. A sharp pain shot through my chest, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. Panic began to rise in my throat. "Alex," I shouted, shaking him harder now. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. I had to get him out of there. I had to save us both. Finally, he stirred. His body jolted, and his eyes shot open, wide and frantic. His breath came in quick gasps, as if he had been holding it for too long. "Did we crash?" he asked, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. I blinked, trying to comprehend his words. The reality of what was happening still hadn't fully settled in my mind. I think so," I replied, my own voice sounding far too calm, considering the circumstances. But there was something even more unsettling now, something deeper than just the wreck. We were no longer on the road. I had no idea how far we'd gone off the path, but the car wasn't where it should have been. It was as if the world itself had shifted, leaving us in an entirely new place. The forest, the trees, they weren't where they had been before. The sense of displacement was overwhelming, and the feeling that something was watching us, waiting, was stronger than ever. "Where are we?" Alex whispered, his voice trembling now. I could hear the same fear that had plagued me since we first entered Ashfield. I didn't know what to say. The car, somehow, was untouched by the crash. There were no dents, no signs that we had just been seconds from slamming into a tree. The engine was still running, but it was eerily quiet outside. No animals, no wind, no rustling of the trees, nothing. "We need to get out," I said, my voice shaky as I reached for the door handle. It opened easily, and I stepped out, taking in the surroundings. Nothing. It was like the world had gone silent. The night was thick with an oppressive, almost suffocating stillness. I could feel it deep in my chest, pressing on me like an invisible weight. Alex followed me, his steps slow, hesitant, like he wasn't entirely sure where he was or if he should even be moving. But we both knew we couldn't stay in the car forever. I wasn't sure what was worse, the terror of being in that ghost town or the unbearable silence that surrounded us now. "We need to go back," Alex said suddenly, his voice barely audible. "Back? To where?" I replied, my voice more aggressive than I intended. I was trying to hold it together, but my nerves were fraying. "To Ashfield," he said, staring off into the distance, his face pale and drawn. "We have to go back. Something isn't right. It's not over." The words hit me harder than I expected. He was right. We couldn't leave. Not now, not after everything we'd seen. Ashfield hadn't let us go. And whatever that figure was, it was still out there. But as I turned, looking toward the direction of the town, something stopped me. I froze, and my heart skipped a beat. In the distance, barely visible in the weak light of the headlights, I saw something moving. It was a figure, just like the one we had seen in the church, walking slowly toward us. I stepped back, my stomach dropping. "Alex." My voice trailed off as the figure drew nearer. It was the same man, the same expressionless face, the same empty eyes. It didn't move like a person, it glided, effortlessly, closer and closer. "Get in the car," I hissed, my voice filled with panic. I grabbed Alex by the arm, pulling him back toward the vehicle. He didn't resist, but his eyes were wide with disbelief. "We can't go back there," Alex muttered, as if he had just now realized the danger we were in. "It's not safe." "I know," I said, my breath coming in ragged bursts. "But we don't have a choice. We need to leave. Now." As we scrambled back into the car, I slammed the door shut with a force that rattled the windows. I didn't care if the figure was behind us, following us. I didn't care about anything except getting away from this place. I slammed the gear shift into drive, and we sped off, the car tearing through the empty road. The figure was gone, but the sense of it, its presence, still lingered in the air. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see that shadow, that twisted, emotionless figure, standing right behind us. But there was nothing. "Where do we go?" Alex asked quietly, his voice still shaky. I didn't have an answer for him. All I knew was that I had to get out. Out of Ashfield. Out of this nightmare. We drove for miles, not saying a word, the hum of the engine the only sound in the car. And as the minutes stretched on, I couldn't help but feel that we were leaving something behind. Something I didn't fully understand, something I could never explain. It was a feeling of being watched, of being followed. No matter how fast we drove, no matter how far we went, it felt like Ashfield was still there, looming over us. The further we got from the town, the more the silence seemed to press in on me. I kept checking the rearview mirror, afraid that I'd see those empty eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing. The road behind us remained clear. Eventually, we reached the highway, the familiar hum of the asphalt under the tires, a welcome sound. We were out. Ashfield was behind us. But the unsettling feeling didn't leave. It never really did. I looked at Alex, and he met my gaze, the unspoken terror still hanging between us. "We'll never talk about this again," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. Agreed. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. By the time we reached the nearest town, the sun was beginning to rise. The world felt different, normal again, almost too normal, like the nightmare had never happened. But I knew better. The horrors of Ashfield hadn't been just dreams. They were real. And whatever had happened there, whatever was still waiting in that ghost town would never be forgotten. I just hoped it never followed us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. It was never over. We had escaped. But some things, some places, don't let go so easily. And I could feel Ashfield still watching just beyond the horizon. The drive back to civilization was long and quiet. With every passing mile, the weight of what happened seemed to lift, but there was no true relief. The memory of Ashfield, its empty streets, the unnerving figure, and the chilling presence that lingered in the air followed us like an unshakable shadow. By the time we reached the nearest town, a sense of normalcy began to creep back. The vibrant morning sunlight felt almost too bright, and the chatter of locals at a gas station brought the feeling of ordinary life crashing back in. But the unease still gnawed at me. No matter how many miles we put between ourselves and that cursed place, I knew one thing for certain: Ashfield hadn't let go of us. Alex and I didn't speak much after we left the ghost town, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of them, but the more I tried, the less I understood. The figure we saw in the church, the feeling of being followed, the deadness in the town, it wasn't something you could explain away. It was real, and in the pit of my stomach, I felt that it wasn't over. There was more to that place, something darker than we could fathom. We didn't talk about Ashfield once we reached the safety of a hotel. We both knew the gravity of what we had seen, and maybe that's why we couldn't voice it. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened at all. But deep down, I knew neither of us would ever forget. The town, the people, or whatever had been left behind would haunt us forever. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were consumed with the town that should have been abandoned, the shadowy figure that had followed us, and the unanswered questions that gnawed at my mind. Why had we gone there in the first place? What was the significance of the town, and what had it wanted from us? I thought about those empty eyes, the figure that walked with purpose, yet made no sound. How could something so unnatural exist in the world? I sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the hotel's air conditioning. I didn't want to think about Ashfield anymore. I wanted to forget. But no matter how much I tried, my mind kept drifting back. It wasn't just the figure, it was the sensation, the atmosphere of that place. It wasn't like anything I had ever felt before. A town so still, so dead, that even the air seemed to hold its breath. That eerie silence that never left us. The truth was, I didn't know what we had encountered there. Whether it was some twisted, supernatural force or something darker that existed between the lines of reality, I couldn't say. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to know. All I knew was that I had survived. We had survived. But the price of that survival, those terrifying moments, had changed something in me. Something fundamental. The next morning, I found myself driving away from the town we had stopped in, Alex beside me, still quiet. I looked at him, searching his face for any sign that he might be feeling the same way I was. The weight of Ashfield still hung between us like a thick fog. He caught my gaze and nodded, as if understanding the unspoken truth we both shared. "Do you think it's over?" I asked, my voice hoarse. I wasn't sure if I was asking for myself or for both of us. Alex took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "I don't know," he replied quietly, "but I don't think we'll ever forget it." We drove for hours in silence after that, the miles between us and Ashfield seeming to melt away. But the further we drove, the stronger the sense that we were being watched grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were eyes on us, even now, even miles away from that cursed town. It's funny how you think you can escape something so dark, but sometimes, no matter how far you run, the darkness follows. The more I tried to convince myself that we were safe, that we were out of the woods, the more my mind played tricks on me. Every passing car, every shadow in the trees seemed to be watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ashfield hadn't finished with us yet. Eventually, we reached a small town where we stopped to refuel. The bright, bustling atmosphere should have felt like a relief, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right. People moved in and out of the gas station, chatting idly and going about their business. But every time I turned around, I couldn't help but feel that someone was staring at me from the corner of my vision. I tried to brush it off, but the unsettling sense of being followed stayed with me. It wasn't just the figure from Ashfield anymore. It was the whole town. The feeling that something was out of place, something lurking in the shadows. No matter where I went, no matter how far I drove, I felt it, the unmistakable presence of something watching, something waiting. That night, as I lay in my hotel room, I kept the lights on, my mind racing. I thought about Ashfield and the figure we had seen. I thought about the eerie silence, the oppressive atmosphere that clung to the place. I thought about how it felt like we had stumbled into a world outside of our own, one that existed in the cracks of reality. And then, as I lay there, the realization hit me. I had never asked the question before. Not out loud, not to anyone. But now it felt impossible to ignore. What if Ashfield wasn't just a place? What if it was a memory one that we were never meant to leave behind? It was then that I understood. I could never fully escape it. Ashfield would stay with me, in my thoughts, in my dreams, in the deep corners of my mind. It would always be there, haunting me, waiting for me to remember. I closed my eyes, letting out a long, steady breath. The truth was, I would never truly be free of that town. Some places, once you've seen them, once you've felt their grip, stay with you forever. And no matter how far you run, no matter how hard you try to escape, they'll always find a way back. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt that familiar chill crawl up my spine, the same feeling I had when we first stepped into Ashfield. The silence, the stillness, the shadow that never left. I've always loved driving at night. There's something calming about it, the solitude of the road stretching endlessly before you, the world fading into the quiet hum of the engine. It had become a sort of ritual for me over the years, a way to clear my mind after a long week. But this particular night would be different, one I'd never be able to forget. It was a Friday evening, one of those crisp fall nights where the air is just cold enough to roll down the windows. I just finished a long day of work, and instead of heading straight home like I usually would, I decided to take a detour. I was hoping the drive would help me clear my mind, perhaps even get a little lost. Sometimes, I felt like I needed that, a break from everything, even if it meant venturing down unfamiliar roads. I'd been driving for nearly 2 hours, my car's headlights slicing through the dark, when I found myself on a road I didn't recognize. It wasn't that the road was new, I just hadn't seen it before. The area around me was rural, sparsely populated, with the occasional house set far back from the road. The kind of place where you could easily drive by and never notice. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like ages, and the silence was deafening. But it wasn't unusual. After all, I was off the beaten path. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. It was just past 10 o'clock. The night sky was clear, but it had a strange stillness to it, like the air itself was holding its breath. There wasn't even the usual hum of insects in the trees. I shrugged it off, thinking I was just tired. As I continued, the road seemed to wind in strange ways, curving in and out of forests, then suddenly opening up to fields. It was the kind of place you could lose yourself in, but in a good way. The road didn't seem to lead anywhere important. It didn't have that feel of a main road. Instead, it was almost as if it was forgotten, left behind by the world. It wasn't long before I noticed a change. There was something off about this road, something I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe it was the way the trees bent unnaturally over the road, creating a canopy that blocked out the stars. Or perhaps it was the faint feeling that I was being watched, a sensation I couldn't shake, even though there was no one around. I tried to push the thought aside, chalking it up to my tiredness. A small town, the kind you see in old movies, appeared in the distance. It looked out of place, like it had been frozen in time. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the empty streets. I slowed down, curiosity getting the better of me. I had no reason to stop, but something about that town, that strange, eerie quiet, made me want to take a look. I turned off the main road and onto the street that led into the town. The buildings, old and weathered, seemed to watch me as I passed by. The windows were dark, the streets silent. I didn't see a single soul. I didn't know why, but something about this place unsettled me. It was almost as if I was intruding on a place that didn't want to be found. Still, I didn't want to overthink it. I was just passing through after all. I made a few turns, hoping to find a gas station or a place to stretch my legs. But as I drove, I noticed something strange. The roads in this town seemed to loop back on themselves. I found myself in the same spot I had passed moments earlier. At first, I thought it was just a strange coincidence. But then it happened again. It was then that I realized I had no idea where I was. The streets that had seemed so familiar when I first entered now felt foreign, like they were shifting before my eyes. No matter how many turns I made, I couldn't escape the same few blocks. The town seemed to be closing in on me. I stopped the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. The air felt thick, heavy, almost suffocating. My breath came out in shallow gasps. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. It was just a weird little town, nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had no idea how long I had been in that town, or how long I would be trapped there. I couldn't shake the feeling that the road I had taken had somehow changed. But it wasn't until I decided to leave that I realized just how wrong I was. I turned the car around, determined to get back on the main road and leave this strange place behind. But when I looked ahead, all I saw was more empty street. No matter how far I drove, the road never seemed to end. It was like I was stuck in some kind of loop, unable to escape. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the street, just beyond the reach of the car's headlights. It was too far to make out clearly, but I knew someone was there, watching. My heart skipped a beat, and I slammed my foot on the gas, desperate to get away. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, frozen in place as I sped past. That's when I realized I wasn't just lost. I was being watched, and I wasn't sure I would make it out of there alive. I kept driving, the engine roaring louder in my ears, until I finally reached the edge of the town. The moment I left, the air seemed to clear, and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest. But the road was far from over. Something else awaited me down the forgotten path. Something I wasn't prepared for. I had no idea how long I would be stuck in that place, or if I would ever make it back home. But I knew one thing for sure: I would never forget that road, that town, or the eyes that followed me the entire way. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the town. It wasn't just the strange way the streets looped back on themselves, or the eerie silence that hung over the place like a thick fog. No, it was something else, something I couldn't explain, but felt deep in my bones. When I finally broke free from the twisted roads of the town, I thought I could breathe easier. The streets became less claustrophobic as I found myself driving down an open stretch of highway again. I kept my hands tightly gripping the steering wheel, the image of the figure standing in the street still haunting me. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, but I refused to let fear take over. I had to focus. I couldn't let my mind wander. I kept my eyes on the road, my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. But just as I thought I was out of the woods, I noticed something strange on the side of the road, a faint light flickering in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a car or some kind of reflection from my own headlights. But as I got closer, I realized the light wasn't coming from any vehicle. It was different. I slowed the car, squinting into the dark. The light was coming from a small, weathered signpost on the side of the road, partially obscured by overgrown grass. As I got closer, I could make out some faint, faded words, but they weren't clear enough for me to read. I pulled the car over, curiosity getting the better of me. I hadn't seen anything like this before. It was out of place. There was no reason for a sign to be out here, in the middle of nowhere. I parked the car and got out, the night air crisp against my skin as I made my way toward the post. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. Something wasn't right. The sign, though simple, looked almost too old, as if it had been standing there for decades, untouched by time. The paint was chipped, and the words on it were barely legible. I leaned in closer, squinting to make out the letters. "Do not proceed," it said in a jagged, barely visible font. The words were hard to read, as if they'd been worn away by years of weathering. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I stepped back. The message, so simple, but so strange. Why would a sign like this be here? Who would put up a sign in the middle of nowhere, telling drivers not to proceed? The words felt like a warning, but I couldn't figure out what it was warning against. I turned back toward the car, but just as I was about to open the door, I heard it a sound, faint at first, but growing louder. A soft tapping noise. It wasn't the wind, nor the rustling of the trees. It was coming from behind me, from the direction of the sign. I froze, my hand still on the door handle. The tapping grew louder, closer. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and uneven. My heart began to race, and I spun around, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The air felt thick again, heavy with the same suffocating presence I had felt earlier. It was as though the world had gone silent. The tapping ceased, replaced by an eerie stillness. I waited for a moment, my breath shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dim light of the car's headlights. It wasn't the same figure from the town, but something about it still sent a wave of dread through me. I couldn't make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. It was humanoid in form, but its features were obscured, no face, no details. Just the silhouette of a person standing in the dark, watching me. I stood frozen, unable to move. My body felt like it was paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what to do. The figure remained still, its shape barely shifting as it loomed just out of reach. I thought about getting in the car, slamming the door shut, and speeding off, but for some reason, my feet wouldn't budge. Then, the figure moved. It was slow at first, hesitant, as though it was unsure whether to approach or remain still. But then, it started toward me. I snapped into motion. I didn't think. I just reacted. My legs finally obeyed, and I ran for the car, diving into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart pounding as I fumbled to start the engine. My hands shook as I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. I didn't even look back. I just hit the gas, my car lurching forward as I sped down the road, away from whatever that thing had been. The road stretched out before me once again, and I didn't stop. I didn't dare. My mind was racing, my body still trembling from what I had just experienced. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the figure had been some trick of the light, or maybe just some person out for a walk. But I knew deep down that it was more than that. I couldn't stop thinking about the sign, about the figure. It all felt so deliberate, like I had been led there, like I was being pushed towards something. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I wanted to leave. I wanted to drive as far away from that place as possible. But that feeling of being watched didn't go away. It stayed with me, in the pit of my stomach, gnawing at me with every mile I put between myself and that road. But the unsettling feeling only grew stronger the longer I drove. It wasn't just the town or the figure I had seen. Something was wrong with the road itself. The more I tried to focus on driving, the more I noticed the oddities that I had been ignoring. The trees along the side of the road, for one, looked strange. The way they grew crooked, twisted, almost unnatural. It was as if they were bending in toward the road, as if they were leaning in to watch me pass. And then The road itself, it wasn't straight, but twisted in a way that didn't make sense. As if the path was deliberately changing, guiding me deeper into the unknown. I didn't know it then, but I was already far from where I thought I was. Far from the safety of the world I knew. And something told me that the further I went, the more I would uncover. Something dark. Something hidden. Each mile I put behind me felt like a step towards safety, but in reality, I was only growing more and more lost. The road, though familiar at first, began to twist and wind in ways that didn't make sense. I had been on long drives before, but nothing like this. The landscape around me seemed to shift, the trees lining the road now casting long, contorted shadows in the fading light of the evening. I could have sworn the air was colder, denser, as if something were suffocating it. I had tried to ignore the strange events that had unfolded, hoping that with enough distance, they would fade away into some kind of distant memory. But the more I drove, the more unsettling occurrences piled up, each one adding to the suffocating weight in my chest. The first few incidents were subtle, a shadow darting just out of the corner of my eye. The faint sound of whispering that would suddenly echo through the empty car, so soft that it seemed like it was coming from nowhere. At first, I wrote them off as fatigue, a product of too many hours on the road, or maybe even just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, things started to get worse. It started with the radio. The first time it happened, I was driving through a particularly desolate stretch of road, the trees so thick on either side that the sunlight barely made it through. The radio crackled, the static rising in volume until it overtook the music. The sound distorted, then briefly I heard a voice faint, almost unintelligible. It was a woman's voice, soft and soothing, but the words didn't make sense. I tried adjusting the dial, hoping it was just a signal issue, but the voice persisted, growing clearer for a brief moment before the static returned. I told myself it was just a glitch, that the station I had been listening to was cutting in and out, but that thought didn't sit well with me. The voice felt too real, like it had been coming from inside the car with me. Then came the lights. At first, it was a single flash in the distance, something far ahead, at the edge of the horizon. I had seen headlights from other cars, so I thought little of it. But when the flashes continued, getting brighter and brighter, they started to feel wrong. They were too fast, like they were blinking in and out of existence. As I drove on, the flashes intensified, faster and faster, until they began to surround me as if the lights were closing in from all directions. I slammed my foot on the brake, heart racing, as I pulled over to the side of the road. The world outside was a blur of flashing lights, an endless strobe that disoriented me completely. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, as I stared out into the night, trying to make sense of what was happening. But nothing made sense. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, my breath shallow, my pulse quickening. When I opened them again, the lights were gone. Just like that. The world around me was still. The only sound was the hum of the engine. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to drive away as fast as I could, but I didn't. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, too afraid to move, too afraid to leave. The quiet seemed unnatural, a sharp contrast to the chaos that had just surrounded me. And that's when I saw it. Just outside the driver's side window, there was something moving in the trees. Something tall, lanky, its silhouette shifting and swaying as though it were trying to get closer. My heart skipped a beat, and I jerked away from the window, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure what I had seen, or if it had been real at all, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. It wasn't just the road anymore. It was me, too. I was becoming something else, something drawn into this strange place, where logic and reason seemed to be slipping away. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like I was being led down this path, one that I had no choice but to follow. By the time the sun set again, I was starting to feel like I had completely lost control. The world around me had become a patchwork of distorted images and sounds, all blending into one long, nightmarish experience. I would pass by a streetlight, and the light would flicker, but for a split second, I would see something else reflected in it, a glimpse of a face, pale and gaunt, staring at me. Each time, I would jerk my head away, telling myself it was nothing, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't a trick. The turning point came one night when I stopped at a small roadside diner to rest. The building stood on its own, tucked away in the corner of the highway, barely lit by the flickering neon sign. There were no other cars parked outside, and the place looked deserted. It felt wrong, but I was too tired to care. I needed food, a break. I parked the car and stepped out into the cool night air. As I walked toward the entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my steps slowed. The silence around me was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the highway. Inside, the diner was empty, save for the old man behind the counter. He looked up when I entered, his face creased with age, his eyes clouded but sharp. "You're out late," he said, his voice low, almost as though he had been waiting for me. His tone was unsettling, like he already knew my presence before I even stepped inside. Yeah. Long drive," I replied, my voice unsteady. He gave me a knowing smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Not many people come through here anymore," he said, his gaze never leaving mine. "Not anymore." I tried to brush off the strange comment, taking a seat at the counter. But as I glanced around the dimly lit diner, I couldn't ignore the odd feeling in my gut. The walls were adorned with faded photographs, old, black and white pictures of people I didn't recognize, some smiling, others with expressions too blank to decipher. But one picture caught my eye. It was a photo of the diner, taken years ago, with a crowd gathered outside. But as I looked closer, something made my blood run cold. There, in the crowd, standing at the edge of the frame, was the same figure I had seen on the road. The tall, shadowy figure. I froze, my hands shaking as I reached for my coffee. The old man's gaze followed mine, and he chuckled softly, his voice like gravel. "You're not the first to see it," he said, "and you won't be the last. That road, it changes you." I didn't ask him to explain. The fear was already setting in. I had to leave. But when I turned back to the door, it was gone. The road, the streetlights, the diner, it was as if the whole place had vanished. The cold air, the empty space, everything had vanished into a strange, suffocating fog. And that's when I realized it. I wasn't just driving down a road. I was in the middle of something much darker. Something much more dangerous. I had stepped into something that couldn't be explained. And the more I tried to leave, the more it pulled me in. The fog outside grew thicker, swirling around the car like a living thing. My headlights barely cut through the haze, and the road ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly, an infinite expanse that led nowhere. My mind raced as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, muscles tight with fear. The moment I had feared was here. Everything felt wrong. The car's engine hummed beneath me, but it was a hollow sound like the hum of something artificial, something that wasn't supposed to exist. A growing sense of dread bubbled up in my chest as the world around me grew darker and more distorted. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, hoping to catch a glimpse of anything that might suggest the way out of this nightmare. But all I saw was darkness. No sign of the road behind me. No other cars. No lights. Just a suffocating blackness, like I was trapped in a vacuum, sealed off from the rest of the world. My heart raced. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Every instinct screamed at me to stop the car, to get out, to run. But there was no place to run to. The fog pressed in on me from all sides, its tendrils curling around the car like something alive. It was as if the world itself had closed in, trapping me in a never-ending loop. Then, in the distance, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the road. Tall, thin, and unnaturally still. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, facing me. My pulse skipped. I had seen that figure before. On the road, at the diner, in the photographs. It was the same shadowy figure, the one I couldn't escape. I slammed my foot down on the brake, bringing the car to a screeching halt. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the figure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But it was no use. The figure was no longer just a shadow on the road. It had shape, form, it was real. And it was here. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry, my voice lost somewhere deep in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, waiting. The air was thick with tension, every second dragging on for what felt like an eternity. Who are you? I whispered, my voice shaking. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard that my fingers were starting to ache. The figure didn't answer. I swallowed hard, the fear in my chest tightening with each passing moment. I knew deep down that whatever this was, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was waiting for me. A cold shiver ran down my spine as the figure slowly started to move. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, as if it were being controlled by some unseen force. It took one step, then another, drawing closer and closer. The fog parted slightly around it, as if it were pushing its way through the very air itself. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure was so close now that I could see it clearly, its long, twisted limbs, the hollow, black void where its face should have been. There was no expression, no eyes, just an endless abyss of nothingness. And then, just as I thought it would reach the car, the figure stopped, dead in its tracks. It tilted its head, as if examining me, studying me. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, caught in a moment that felt like it would never end. But then, to my horror, it spoke. Not with words, but with something deeper, a presence that filled the car, that pressed in on my chest, suffocating me. It wasn't a voice I could hear with my ears. It was a voice I could feel in my bones, in the very core of my being. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice said, and I felt the words pulse through my skull like a dull ache. It wasn't a voice, not really. It was more like a sensation, a wave of dread that washed over me. I could feel it in my chest, in my stomach, twisting like a cold, dead weight. "Who? What are you?" I gasped, my voice barely audible. There was a pause, a heavy silence, before the figure took another step forward, its twisted form impossibly closer now. I could see the darkness swirling within it, like an endless void that sucked in everything around it. I could feel the weight of its presence pressing on me, crushing me. "You shouldn't have come," it repeated, its voice reverberating through my mind. I tried to look away, to turn the car around and drive as fast as I could, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the car had become part of the nightmare, part of the trap. The fog outside had thickened again, closing in around us, and I could no longer see anything beyond the figure that stood before me. The world was silent now, no hum of the engine, no sound of traffic, no sign of life. It was as though I had crossed into a different dimension, a place outside time and space. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just a road. This wasn't just some forgotten stretch of highway. It was a place that had been waiting for me, a place that had drawn me in with its eerie silence, its strange happenings. It wasn't a coincidence that I had found myself here. This road wasn't lost. I was. The figure loomed over the car now, so close that I could feel its presence like a weight in the air. I could almost hear its breath, shallow and cold, as it leaned closer to the window. The fog seemed to warp around it, forming shapes and shadows that seemed to move and twist with every passing second. And then, in one swift motion, it reached out its hand, or what passed for a hand pressing against the glass. The touch sent a jolt of ice through my body, and the world outside seemed to ripple. I could hear the faintest of whispers, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart hammered in my chest as the figure's face, or lack thereof, pressed closer to the glass. There was nothing there, just emptiness. The voice returned, deep and cold. "You've crossed over. There's no turning back." My mind reeled, and a wave of dizziness hit me. The fog, the darkness, the figure, it all seemed to collapse into one single point of unbearable pressure. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat had gone dry. My body was numb. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure's hand slid down the glass, leaving a streak of something dark, like ink. And with that, everything went quiet. The fog cleared. The figure was gone. I was left alone in the stillness, surrounded by an emptiness that felt like it would swallow me whole. I sat there for what seemed like hours, not knowing what to do, where to go. I couldn't even remember the road anymore. It had faded into a blur. All that remained was the overwhelming sense that I was no longer in control. I had crossed the line. I had entered something I shouldn't have. And now there was no escape. The oppressive silence that followed the figure's disappearance hung in the air, suffocating, as though the world had decided to hold its breath. I could feel the cold sweat soaking my shirt, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. My heart raced, still trying to escape the memory of the dark figure, the chilling voice that reverberated in my skull. My mind raced, thoughts jumbled and incoherent, fighting against the heavy weight of terror that pressed in on me. I had to get out. I had to leave. But where would I go? The fog had cleared, but in its place was an unsettling quiet that gnawed at my nerves. I had no sense of direction, no road signs, no landmarks, just an endless stretch of nothingness. The car felt too small, too fragile in this vast, empty place. It was as if I had driven straight into some kind of void, a place where nothing and no one existed. I looked at the road ahead, my foot hovering over the accelerator. Should I keep driving? Should I turn around? I stared at the rearview mirror, half expecting the figure to appear once more, emerging from the fog, ready to claim me. But the mirror was empty. The road behind me remained unchanged, a dark and empty stretch that seemed to extend forever. But that didn't make me feel safe. I had crossed a boundary. I had entered a place I wasn't supposed to be. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lingering just beyond my perception, waiting for me to make a mistake. My pulse quickened, and for a moment, I considered abandoning the car, leaving it behind, stepping out into the unknown. But then the fear returned, a sharp jolt in my chest. I couldn't leave the car. It felt like my only link to the outside world, the only thing that could carry me back to safety, or whatever was left of it. I decided to keep moving. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, and the car jolted forward, its tires humming over the road. The engine roared to life, filling the empty space with sound. But the sound was hollow, distant, as if the engine itself didn't belong here. I glanced out of the window again, scanning the horizon for any sign of life, any indication that I wasn't alone in this eerie, desolate place. But there was nothing. The road stretched ahead, a never-ending path that seemed to twist and wind, disappearing into the fog. The headlights flickered for a moment, casting strange shadows across the road, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It was as if the very act of driving was pulling me deeper into this strange reality. I had to stop. I slammed my foot down on the brake, bringing the car to a screeching halt. My hands shook violently as I gripped the wheel, the tension in my chest unbearable. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I couldn't keep driving aimlessly. It felt wrong. Every part of me screamed to turn back, but I knew that the figure was right. There was no turning back. I turned off the engine and sat in the stillness. The car's interior was cold, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound. I stared at the steering wheel, my mind a whirl of questions I couldn't answer. What was that figure? Why was it following me? Was this a punishment or something else entirely? And most terrifying of all, what had I stepped into? I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my mind replaying every moment since I had entered this cursed road. The strange events, the fog, the figure, it was all too much to grasp. And yet, there was something else beneath the fear, something deeper that troubled me even more. Something I couldn't put into words. It wasn't just that I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was something worse. Something far older and more sinister. I had become part of a story that had been unfolding long before my arrival, and it seemed like I was a pawn in a game I didn't understand. With a deep breath, I shifted the car into gear and started driving again. I wasn't sure where I was headed, but I couldn't stay still. I had to keep moving, even if it was just to escape the crushing silence that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The fog had lifted completely now, revealing a landscape that was eerily familiar, yet somehow distorted. The trees were too still, the shadows too long, and the sky above me was an unnatural shade of gray, like a constant twilight that would never break. Nothing felt real, not anymore. I saw it again. In the distance, at the edge of the road, the same figure stood. The same haunting shape. It hadn't moved. It didn't seem to notice me. It simply stood there, waiting, watching. I felt a chill wash over me, but this time I didn't stop the car. I didn't even slow down. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal as I drove past it, keeping my eyes straight ahead. I didn't dare look at it, didn't dare acknowledge its presence. It was there, yes, but I wasn't going to let it control me anymore. I was done being afraid. For miles, nothing changed. The road stretched on, endless, devoid of life or meaning. My mind kept wandering back to the figure, the voice, the place I had found myself in. But as I drove on, the panic slowly started to subside. I began to tell myself that I was leaving it all behind, that whatever I had encountered here was nothing more than a nightmare. A terrifying one, yes, but a nightmare nonetheless. I wasn't sure how long I had been driving, but eventually I saw a sign. A real one. A road sign marking the exit to a town. It was almost too good to be true. The familiar letters, the promise of civilization, felt like a lifeline. I had made it. I was almost out. I pulled off the road and onto a narrow side street. The fog had returned, but it felt different now, thinner, less oppressive. The town was small, quiet, almost empty. I drove through its streets, eyes scanning for a place to stop. The weight of the experience, of everything that had happened, hung over me like a cloud. I eventually parked outside a small diner. The neon sign flickered faintly, but it was enough. I stepped out of the car, my legs shaky, my body drained. The diner's door creaked open as I walked inside. The waitress behind the counter looked up at me, her eyes widening for a moment. She didn't say anything, but there was something about her expression that made me uneasy. I ordered a coffee, anything to calm my nerves, and sat in the corner booth, trying to steady my shaking hands. But the question still lingered in my mind. Had I really escaped? Or had I simply passed into another version of the same nightmare? Would the figure follow me here, like it had followed me before? As I sipped my coffee, I felt it again, that sense of being watched. Not by anyone in the diner, but by something else. Something that had been waiting for me, even here. And as the minutes ticked by, I realized one unsettling truth. I had never truly left the road behind. The coffee in front of me had gone cold, but I didn't notice. The diner was still, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of a cup the only sounds. My hands gripped the edge of the table, the remnants of my earlier fears still clinging to my skin like an invisible fog. Outside, the world seemed unnaturally still, and the streetlights flickered in a rhythm that almost felt too intentional. I could hear my heartbeat, slow and steady, but it wasn't enough to drown out the gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach. The waitress returned to wipe down a nearby table, her movements mechanical. I watched her as she passed, but she didn't seem to notice me anymore. Her face was neutral, her eyes distant. It was almost as though I had already been forgotten. But I couldn't forget the feeling, the haunting sensation of something lingering just beyond my perception. I couldn't escape it. No matter how far I'd driven, no matter how many roads I'd crossed, the shadow of that figure remained with me. Every time I thought I was free, that I had left the nightmare behind, it crept back into my thoughts. The chilling voice, the figure standing by the side of the road, the way it seemed to be waiting for me. I couldn't shake the idea that I was still a part of something far bigger than myself, something that wasn't finished with me yet. I pushed the chair back and stood up, the scrape of the legs against the floor sounding louder than it should. I glanced around the diner once more, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread. The waitress was gone now. The only signs of life in the small space were the clock ticking on the wall and the steady hum of the kitchen. A part of me wanted to stay, to find comfort in the mundane, to let the illusion of normalcy wash over me. But it was fleeting. I had become too aware of something else, something lurking in the spaces between the light and the dark. As I walked out of the diner and into the night, the air felt heavier. It pressed in on me, thick and suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The fog had returned, just as it had on that road. But this time, it was worse. It didn't just cling to the road, it seemed to crawl up the sides of the buildings, curling like tendrils of smoke, choking the life out of everything it touched. I made my way back to the car, my feet feeling like they were dragging through the thick mist. The headlights flickered as I approached, casting strange shadows that seemed to move with a mind of their own. The car door slammed shut behind me with a dull thud, and I paused for a moment to gather myself. Should I leave now? Should I turn the key and drive away, never looking back? The urge to flee was overwhelming, but something stopped me. Something held me there, anchored to the spot. I knew, deep down, that there was nowhere to go. Not really. The road I had been on, the one that led me to this place, it wasn't just a physical path. It was a connection, a thread that stretched through time and space, binding me to something beyond my understanding. And that figure, that silent presence, was the keeper of that thread. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life, the soft vibrations running through my body. The mist outside seemed to thicken, almost as if the world was closing in around me. I pressed the gas pedal, slowly at first, then with more force as the road in front of me seemed to open up. The fog seemed to swirl, but in the rearview mirror, I saw something that stopped me cold. The figure, standing at the edge of the parking lot. It wasn't just standing there this time. It was moving toward the car, slowly, deliberately. The space between us seemed to stretch and contract, like time itself was bending. I slammed the car into reverse, heart racing, and tore out of the lot, the tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just drove, faster and faster, desperate to get away, to break free from the grip that had tightened around me since I first stepped onto that forgotten road. But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how many turns I took, the fog always returned, always closed in. The figure remained a constant presence, its shadow stretching across the windshield, never quite disappearing. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. The road stretched on, and the fog never lifted. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped in a loop, a cycle that would never end. The figure was always there, just out of sight, but never gone. Every corner I turned, every time I thought I had outrun it, it would appear once more. And I realized then, with a clarity that chilled me to the bone, that I wasn't meant to escape. This wasn't a road meant to be traveled. It wasn't a place I was meant to leave. The figure, the voice, the fog, they were part of something larger. They were part of the road, part of me. I pulled the car to a stop, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. The figure was there again, standing directly in front of the car now, its silhouette dark against the fog. It wasn't just waiting anymore. It was watching me, and I understood, deep in my soul, that it was time to face it. The figure slowly approached the car, its movements deliberate, unhurried. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, but I didn't move. I couldn't. The fog was so thick now that the world beyond the windshield was a blur, but there was no mistaking the figure's presence. It was finally here. I stepped out of the car, my feet unsteady on the ground, and I felt the chill of the fog seep into my bones. The figure was closer now, towering over me, and I could feel its cold gaze on me, as if it were peeling away the layers of my soul. I didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. And then, as though everything had come full circle, the figure reached out, its hand just inches from my face, and I knew then that this was where the road had been leading me all along. There was no escape. There was no end. I was part of the forgotten road now, part of the endless cycle, just another lost soul trapped in the fog. And as the world around me faded into nothing, I realized that sometimes the scariest thing of all is not what you encounter, but what you become.